I was driving my 27-foot trailer along the Alaska highway with my daughter, heading towards the Canada-US border. It was a crisp autumn day, the kind where the air feels sharp in your lungs, and the golden leaves create a stunning contrast against the blue sky. We'd been on the road for hours, and I was starting to feel the fatigue setting in. My daughter had dozed off in the passenger seat, her head lolling against the window. As we rounded a bend in the highway, something caught my eye that made me slam on the brakes. The trailer lurched, and my daughter jolted awake with a startled, "What's going on?" I couldn't speak. I just pointed, my hand shaking slightly, at what I was seeing through the windshield. There, not more than 50 yards from the road, was the most bizarre creature I've ever laid eyes on. It was massive, easily over 9 feet tall, with a reddish-blonde coloration that stood out starkly against the white bark of the birch trees it was standing among. But what really struck me was its proportions. This thing had shoulders that would make a linebacker look scrawny, and its head seemed to sit directly on those massive shoulders. There was no distinct neck that I could see. As we watched, frozen in disbelief, the creature reached up and effortlessly grasped at the upper branches of one of the birch trees. Its arm length was incredible, far beyond what any human could manage. "Dad, what is that?" my daughter whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I shook my head, unable to form words. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this some kind of bear? No, bears don't stand like that, and they certainly don't have arms that long. A moose? Definitely not. This was something else. The creature seemed oblivious to our presence at first, methodically stripping leaves from the branches it was grasping. Its movements were surprisingly graceful for something so large. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to get a picture. This was the kind of thing you needed proof of, or no one would ever believe you. As I raised the phone to snap a photo, the creature's head swiveled in our direction. I felt a chill run down my spine as I made eye contact with it. Its eyes were dark and intelligent, and in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that this was no animal, at least not any animal known to science. The creature's reaction was instantaneous. 1 second it was there, massive and impossible, and the next it was gone, moving with a speed that defied its size. It didn't run away exactly. It was more like it simply ceased to be where it had been standing. "Did you get a picture?" my daughter asked urgently. I looked down at my phone and cursed. In my shock, I'd forgotten to actually press the button. The screen showed nothing but the empty forest where the creature had been moments before. We sat there for a few minutes, both of us breathing heavily, trying to process what we'd just seen. Eventually, I put the trailer back in gear, and we continued down the highway. But things felt different now, charged with a new awareness of the unknown. As we drove, we kept our eyes peeled for any other travelers, wanting desperately to share our experience, to have someone else confirm what we'd seen. But the highway was eerily empty. We stopped at the next rest area we came across, needing a break to collect ourselves. As I stepped out of the truck, my legs felt wobbly, like I'd just stepped off a roller coaster. My daughter and I looked at each other, both of us pale and wide-eyed. "That really happened, right?" she asked, her voice small. "We both saw it?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah, honey, we both saw it." We spent the next hour at that rest stop, poring over my daughter's phone, searching the internet for any information about what we might have seen. We found stories of Bigfoot sightings, of course, but none of them quite matched what we'd witnessed. This creature had been different. Its coloration, its impossible reach, the way it moved. As the day wore on and we got back on the road, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time we passed a stand of trees, I found myself scanning the branches, half expecting to see that massive figure again. We stopped for gas late in the afternoon, and I struck up a conversation with the attendant, a grizzled old man who looked like he'd lived in these parts his whole life. "Seen anything strange on the highway today?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. The old man gave me a long, considering look. "Folks see all sorts of things on this road," he said finally. "What sort of strange are you talking about?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound crazy. "I don't know. Just anything out of the ordinary." He chuckled, but there was something knowing in his eyes. "Son, in these parts, the ordinary ain't always what you think it is. Best to keep your eyes open and your mouth shut, if you catch my meaning." I nodded, not entirely sure I did catch his meaning, but feeling like I'd just been given some sort of warning. As we neared the border, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. The forest seemed to press in closer to the road, the shadows between the trees growing deeper. My daughter had been quiet for most of the afternoon, but suddenly she grabbed my arm. "Dad," she said, her voice tight. "Look." I followed her gaze and felt my heart skip a beat. There, just for a moment, I thought I saw movement in the trees, a flash of reddish-blonde fur, the suggestion of a massive shape. But as quickly as it appeared, it was gone again. We crossed the border without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd brushed up against something beyond our understanding. The memory of those intelligent eyes, that impossible reach, stayed with me long after we'd reached our destination. In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself obsessively researching cryptozoology, looking for any information that might explain what we'd seen, but nothing quite fit. We'd experienced something unique, something that defied easy categorization. I've thought about going back, about trying to find that spot on the highway again. But something always holds me back. Maybe it's fear, or maybe it's the realization that some things are better left as mysteries. All I know is that whenever I see a birch tree now, I can't help but look up, half expecting to see a massive, impossible hand reaching for the highest branches. And I wonder, not for the first time, what other secrets those northern forests might be hiding. Story 2. I was on a solo backpacking trip in a remote part of Alaska near King Salmon. It was my first time exploring this particular wilderness area, and I was excited to get away from civilization for a while. The rugged beauty of the Alaskan landscape never fails to amaze me. On the third day of my trip, I hiked deep into a valley that felt completely untouched by humans. The only signs of life were some moose and bear tracks here and there. As I made my way along a small stream, something caught my eye that made me stop in my tracks. There, in the soft mud of the stream bank, was a footprint unlike anything I'd ever seen before. At first I thought it must be a bear print, but as I got closer, I realized it was clearly a bipedal footprint, but massive. It had to be over 2 feet long, with distinct toe impressions. My heart started racing as I tried to process what I was looking at. There was no way this could be a human print. It was far too large, and we were miles from any trails or signs of human activity. I knelt down to examine it more closely, my hands shaking slightly as I placed my own boot next to it for scale. My size 11 hiking boot looked tiny in comparison. The print was deeply pressed into the mud, indicating whatever made it was extremely heavy. As I looked more carefully, I could make out what appeared to be dermal ridges, like fingerprints, in the impression of the toes. Forcing myself to stay calm, I stood up and scanned the surrounding area. That's when I noticed there was a line of these massive prints leading away from the stream and into a thicket of dense brush. My mind was reeling as I tried to come up with a rational explanation. But deep down, a part of me already knew these had to be Bigfoot tracks. I've always been fascinated by Bigfoot lore, but never truly believed the creatures existed. Now, faced with this incredible evidence, I felt a mix of excitement and fear. What if the creature that made these prints was still nearby? Should I try to follow the tracks or get out of there? After a few minutes of internal debate, my curiosity won out. I decided to carefully follow the trackway and see where it led. With my heart pounding, I made my way into the brush, trying to move as quietly as possible. The tracks continued for about a quarter-mile before disappearing into a rocky area where I could no longer discern any prints. As I stood there trying to figure out my next move, I suddenly had an overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I froze in place, straining my ears for any sound. For several long moments, all I could hear was my own breathing and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then I heard it, a deep, rumbling vocalization unlike anything I've heard before. It was coming from somewhere up the slope to my right, maybe 100 yards away. It wasn't quite a growl, but more like a cross between a lion's roar and the low-frequency rumble of an elephant. My blood ran cold, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was in the presence of something extraordinary. I slowly turned my head towards the sound, and that's when I saw it. Partially obscured by the trees about 75 yards up the hill was a huge, dark figure. It was clearly bipedal and covered in reddish-brown hair. Even from that distance I could tell it was massive, at least 8 feet tall and powerfully built. For a few seconds we just stared at each other, neither moving. Then it let out another one of those incredible vocalizations, so deep I could feel it resonating in my chest. That shocked me out of my frozen state, and I stumbled backwards, nearly falling over a log. The creature took a step forward, and I saw its face clearly for the first time. It had a pronounced brow ridge and a wide, flat nose. But it was the eyes that struck me most. Dark and incredibly intelligent-looking. There was no doubt in my mind that I was looking at a sentient being. Overwhelmed with fear and awe, I turned and ran. I crashed through the underbrush, not even trying to be quiet anymore. Behind me, I heard heavy footsteps and the snap of branches. After sprinting for what felt like an eternity, I finally burst out of the woods and back to the stream where I'd first seen the tracks. I frantically looked around for somewhere to hide, spotting a jumble of boulders nearby. I wedged myself into a crevice between 2 large rocks, trying to quiet my ragged breathing. For several tense minutes I waited, listening intently. But I heard nothing pursuing me. Eventually I gathered the courage to peek out. The valley was peaceful and still, with no sign of the creature. I stayed hidden for at least an hour, debating what to do. Part of me wanted to go back and try to get photographic evidence, but the rational part of my brain knew that would be incredibly dangerous. In the end, self-preservation won out, and I decided to cut my trip short and hike back to civilization. That night, as I lay in my tent, utterly exhausted but too wired to sleep, I replayed the encounter over and over in my mind. I still couldn't quite believe what had happened. In the space of a few hours, my entire worldview had been shaken to its core. I knew that even if I told people, most wouldn't believe me without hard evidence. So I decided to keep the experience to myself, at least for the time being. It's been several months now since that day in the Alaskan wilderness. I still think about it constantly, wondering if I'll ever have another encounter like that. Part of me hopes I will, while another part hopes I never see one of those creatures again. The experience has given me a newfound respect for the mysteries that still exist in the world's remote places. I know many will be skeptical of my story, and I understand that. If someone had told me this tale a year ago, I probably wouldn't have believed it either. But I know what I saw that day. Those massive footprints and that incredible creature were undeniably real. It's made me realize how little we truly know about the world around us, and how much wonder and mystery still exist if we're willing to look for it. I haven't been back to that specific area since then, but I find myself constantly drawn to other remote wilderness spots, always scanning the tree line and searching for tracks. That encounter awakened something in me, a deep curiosity about what other undiscovered creatures might be out there. I know the odds of seeing another Bigfoot are incredibly slim, but now that I know they're real, I can't help but hope for another glimpse of these elusive and magnificent beings. For now, I'm content to keep this incredible secret to myself. But I often wonder how many other people have had similar encounters in the vast wilderness areas of North America. How many of us are out there, silently carrying the knowledge that Bigfoot is real? It's a heavy but thrilling burden to bear, and it's given me a profound appreciation for the wild places of the world and the secrets they still hold. Story 3. I'll never forget that day in July 1980. It was supposed to be just another camping trip with my Boy Scout troop, but it turned into something I still can't fully explain, even after all these years. We were a group of deaf scouts from Troop 32, out exploring the lakes near Camp Bradley in Custer County, Idaho. The area was beautiful, all pristine forests and crystal-clear lakes. I was 14 at the time, and so excited to be out in nature with my friends. That morning, a few of us decided to hike a trail near one of the smaller lakes. There were 3 of us, me and 2 other scouts named Jake and Tommy. We'd gone maybe a mile down the trail when it happened. I remember every detail like it was yesterday. The sun was filtering through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Birds were chirping and a light breeze rustled the leaves. It was peaceful and quiet, until suddenly it wasn't. I felt it before I saw it. A weird vibration in the ground, like heavy footsteps. Then movement caught my eye about 75 feet ahead on the trail. At first I thought it was a bear, but as I focused I realized it was walking on 2 legs. My blood ran cold as this massive creature came into view. It had to be 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in thick brown hair. The legs were huge and muscular. It moved with this odd grace, powerful but smooth strides. I froze in place, my heart pounding. Jake grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. Tommy made a strangled noise next to me. We were all seeing the same impossible thing. The creature paused for a second and seemed to look in our direction. I'll never forget its face, so human-like yet so alien at the same time. Dark eyes peered out from under a prominent brow. Then in a flash it was gone, disappearing into the thick forest. We stood there in shock for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or 2. Finally, Jake signed with shaking hands. "What was that?" Tommy just kept shaking his head in disbelief. I knew what I'd seen, even if my brain couldn't fully process it. "Bigfoot," I signed back. It had to be Sasquatch. We practically ran back to camp, tripping over ourselves in our haste to tell the others. But of course no one believed us. They thought we were playing a prank or had seen a bear. Our troop leader just laughed it off. "Boys and their imaginations," he signed, shaking his head. But the 3 of us knew the truth. We'd seen something extraordinary and unexplainable. The rest of the camping trip passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on anything else. Every rustle in the bushes made me jump. I kept expecting to see that creature again, peering at us from between the trees. Sleep was almost impossible. I'd jolt awake at the slightest sound, heart racing. When we got home, I tried to research everything I could about Bigfoot sightings. This was way before the internet, so I haunted the local library, poring over books and newspapers. I found some stories similar to ours, but nothing that fully captured what we'd experienced. My parents were worried about my new obsession. They tried to convince me it had just been a bear, or maybe even a person in a costume playing a prank. But I knew better. No costume could move like that creature did. No human could be that massive yet so oddly graceful. As the years passed, the memory never faded. Jake, Tommy and I stayed in touch. bonded by our shared experience. We'd get together sometimes and talk about that day, reassuring each other that we weren't crazy, that what we saw was real. I'm in my 50s now, but I still think about it all the time. Was it really Bigfoot? Some unknown species of primate, or something even stranger? I don't have answers, just the vivid memory of those few surreal moments on that forest trail. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever see anything like it again. Part of me hopes I will, to prove to myself once and for all that it was real. But another part of me is terrified at the thought. The raw power of that creature, the alien intelligence in its eyes. It shook me to my core. I've gone back to that area a few times over the years, hoping to recapture some of that experience. But the forests feel different now, less magical, more mundane. Maybe it's just that I'm older, or maybe whatever doorway to the unknown opened that day has long since closed. Still, I keep my eyes open. Every time I'm in the woods, a part of me is on alert, scanning the trees for movement, listening for heavy footsteps or strange vocalizations. I know most people would think I'm crazy if I told them, so I keep it to myself mostly, this secret knowledge that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. That day changed me fundamentally. It opened my eyes to possibilities I'd never considered before, made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. In a way, I'm grateful for the experience. It gave my life a sense of wonder and mystery that I might never have had otherwise. But it also left me with an unshakable feeling of unease, a nagging sense that we're not alone out there in the wilderness, that there are creatures watching us from the shadows, intelligent and powerful beyond our comprehension. So I keep searching, in my own quiet way, reading about other encounters, comparing notes with Jake and Tommy, always hoping for some new piece of evidence that will finally prove what we saw that day, because I know the truth. For a few brief moments on a sunny July morning in 1980, 3 deaf Boy Scouts came face to face with something extraordinary, something that shouldn't exist, but undeniably does, and nothing has ever been quite the same since. Story 4. I was working as a wildlife technician in Valley County, Idaho at the time. It was a job I loved, being out in nature, studying the local wildlife, and helping to preserve the beautiful wilderness. November 20th started like any other day. I headed out early in the morning to do some routine tracking along a stream near Little Lake, east of McCall. The air was crisp and cold, my breath visible in little puffs as I made my way through the forest. As I walked along the stream bank, something caught my eye that made me stop in my tracks. There, in the soft mud by the water's edge, was a footprint unlike anything I had ever seen before. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but as I knelt down to examine it more closely, I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The print was massive, easily 14 inches long and 6 inches wider than my size 10 boots. And this wasn't just one isolated print. There was a whole trail of them, leading right across the stream. I've been tracking wildlife for years, but I had never encountered anything like this. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I ruled out all the usual suspects: bears, moose, elk, wolves, mountain lions. None of them could have made tracks this size or shape, and the way the tracks crossed the stream was downright eerie. The water at that spot was hip-deep on me, but there was no sign of disturbance in the prints. It was as if whatever made them had simply glided across the surface. As I followed the tracks, my unease grew. Based on the depth and size, I estimated that whatever left these prints had to weigh at least 400–600 pounds, 2 to 3 times my own weight. The thought of encountering a creature that size out here in the wilderness made my heart race. I tried to stay calm and rational, but my instincts were screaming at me that something was very wrong. The forest suddenly felt different, oppressive and watchful. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. As I continued to document and photograph the tracks, I noticed other strange details. There were places where it looked like the creature had reached up and snapped branches 8 to 9 feet off the ground. What kind of animal could do that? I'm 6'2", and I couldn't come close to reaching that high. The tracks led deeper into a particularly dense part of the forest. The trees grew close together here, branches interlocking overhead to create a canopy that blocked out much of the daylight. As I pushed through the underbrush, I suddenly froze. There, about 50 yards ahead of me, I saw movement. Something large was moving through the trees. I caught glimpses of dark fur and a massive, lumbering shape. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to process what I was seeing. It moved in a bipedal gait, but was far too large to be human. For a moment, our eyes met. I'll never forget that moment, staring into eyes that were unmistakably intelligent, but not human. They were a deep, reddish-brown color, filled with what looked like curiosity and wariness. In that instant, I knew I was face to face with something that shouldn't exist. I don't know how long we stared at each other. It felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Then, with shocking speed for something so large, it turned and crashed away through the underbrush. The sound of snapping branches and its heavy footfalls faded quickly, leaving me alone in the sudden silence. I stood there, trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Part of me wanted to follow, to try and get another glimpse or find more evidence, but a deeper, more primal part of me knew that would be incredibly dangerous. Whatever that creature was, it was not something to be trifled with. With shaking hands, I gathered up my equipment and samples and made my way back to my vehicle as quickly as I could. The entire way, I felt like I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified in my hyper-alert state. I've spent years trying to rationalize what I saw that day. I've gone over every possibility, tried to convince myself it was just a bear or some other known animal. But deep down, I know that's not true. What I encountered that day was something science can't explain, something that shouldn't exist but does. I never reported what I saw officially. Who would believe me? I'd be laughed out of my job, my reputation ruined. But I know what I saw. Those eyes, that massive shape moving through the trees, it's seared into my memory forever. To this day, I can't go into the deep woods without feeling that same sense of unease. Every time I'm out tracking, part of me is always on alert, wondering if I'll have another encounter. I've never seen anything like it again, but I know it's out there. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the forest, I swear I can feel those eyes watching me again. I don't know what to call what I saw that day. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, some unknown species. The name doesn't really matter. What matters is that it exists, and it's out there in the wilderness, avoiding human contact. Part of me hopes to see it again someday, to prove to myself that I'm not crazy. But another part hopes I never do. Some things are better left as mysteries, I suppose. So that's my story. I've never told anyone before, but I needed to share it. If you're ever out in the wilderness of Idaho, keep your eyes open. You never know what might be watching you from the shadows of the forest. And if you hear heavy footsteps or see massive tracks in the mud, my advice is to turn around and leave. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 5. I'll never forget that day in August 1981. I was 17 years old, living in a small town near Pinehurst, Idaho. My passion was riding my motorcycle through the back roads and trails in the mountains. I'd spend hours exploring remote areas, feeling free and alive as I carved through winding paths in the wilderness. That particular day started like any other summer adventure. I woke up early, grabbed some snacks and water, and headed out on my bike towards Kingston. The air was crisp and cool as I made my way into the mountains, the smell of pine trees filling my lungs. I loved the solitude out there, far from any signs of civilization. After a couple hours of riding, I decided to explore a new trail I'd never been on before. It was pretty overgrown and rugged, winding its way up the mountainside through dense forest. The trail got increasingly narrow and challenging as I climbed higher in elevation. Eventually, I came to a small clearing and decided to take a break. I killed the engine and dismounted, stretching my legs after the long ride. As I walked around the clearing, something caught my eye. An unusual depression in the soft clay soil near the tree line. Curious, I went over to investigate. What I saw made my blood run cold. There in the dirt was an enormous footprint, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was huge, at least 14 inches long and 8 inches wide. The impression was deep, like whatever made it was extremely heavy. I crouched down to examine it more closely, my mind racing. This was no bear print, and definitely not human. The shape was all wrong. 5 distinct toes, but massively oversized. My first thought was Bigfoot, but I quickly dismissed that as ridiculous. There had to be a logical explanation. As I studied the print, the hairs on the back of my neck suddenly stood up. I had the overwhelming sense that I was being watched. My eyes darted to the dense forest surrounding the clearing, searching for movement. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a large, dark figure just inside the tree line, about 50 yards away. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing there. Unsettled, I quickly stood up and scanned the area. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No birds chirping, no squirrels rustling in the underbrush. Just eerie silence. My heart was pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination running wild, but I couldn't shake the feeling of a presence nearby. Something primitive and instinctual was screaming at me to get out of there fast. With shaking hands, I pulled out my pocket camera and snapped a couple quick photos of the footprint. Looking back, I wish I had taken more time to document it properly. But in the moment, I was too freaked out to think clearly. I practically ran back to my motorcycle, fumbling with the keys as I started it up. As the engine roared to life, I thought I heard a strange vocalization from somewhere in the forest, a deep, guttural sound, unlike any animal I was familiar with. Panic surged through me. I gunned the throttle and tore out of there as fast as I dared on the narrow trail. Branches whipped past me as I raced down the mountainside. I didn't slow down or look back until I was miles away on the main road. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, my hands were trembling and I felt nauseous from the adrenaline. I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Was my mind just playing tricks on me? The rational part of my brain said there had to be a normal explanation. Maybe it was an elaborate hoax or some kind of military test site. But deep down, I knew I had encountered something unexplainable. I never told anyone about it at the time. I was afraid people would think I was crazy or making it up. The few times I tried to casually bring up Bigfoot sightings to friends, they just laughed it off. So I kept it to myself, but the memory of that day haunted me. For weeks afterwards, I had trouble sleeping. Every little sound outside my window would startle me awake. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, questioning what I had experienced. The few photos I took came out blurry and inconclusive. Part of me wished I had investigated further, but mostly I was just relieved to have gotten out of there safely. That day changed me. I lost my enthusiasm for solo backcountry exploration. Whenever I rode my motorcycle after that, I stuck to well-traveled roads and avoided remote areas. The mountains that had once felt like my playground now seemed ominous and forbidding. Even now, 40 years later, I still get chills thinking about it. I've read other accounts of Bigfoot encounters over the years that are eerily similar to what I experienced. While I can't say for certain what I encountered that day, I know it was something far outside the realm of normal wildlife. Sometimes I wonder if that creature is still out there, roaming those lonely mountain forests. Part of me wants to go back someday and try to find answers, but a bigger part of me is content to leave that mystery in the past. Whatever it was, that brief encounter was enough to convince me that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. I still love the outdoors, but I've never felt quite as carefree in the wilderness as I did before that day. That massive footprint and shadowy figure remains seared in my memory. While I can't explain it, I know what I saw was real, and it forever changed my perception of what might be lurking in the dark corners of the world, just beyond the edge of civilization. Story 6. I was living in Bonner County, Idaho at the time. A bunch of us decided to go on one of those cheesy Halloween hayrides, you know, where they take you through the woods at night and people in costumes jump out to scare you. There were about 16 of us packed onto this rickety old wagon, laughing and joking around as we bounced along the trail. I remember it was a crisp, clear night. The moon was full and cast an eerie glow through the trees. The air had that distinct fall smell, leaves and wood smoke. As we went deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around us, branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. At one point, the trail forked and our wagon slowed down. That's when I saw it. In the shadows between two massive pines, there was something. At first I thought it was just another actor in a costume ready to jump out, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized this was no costume. Crouched there in the darkness was the largest creature I've ever seen. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, even hunched over like that. Its body was covered in thick, matted hair, not fur, really, more like long human hair. In the moonlight, I could make out massive, muscular limbs and broad shoulders. But what struck me most was how utterly silent it was. This enormous being was right there, mere feet from our noisy wagon, yet it didn't make a sound. No rustling, no breathing, nothing. Just watching us with gleaming eyes that reflected the moonlight. I'm a pretty big guy myself, 6'3", and solidly built. But this thing made me feel tiny. I remember thinking that it could have reached out and snatched any of us off that wagon without breaking a sweat. The craziest part? No one else seemed to notice it. Everyone else was laughing and chatting, completely oblivious. I wanted to say something, to point it out, but I was frozen. It was like my voice wouldn't work. As we passed by, I locked eyes with the creature. In that moment, I felt something, not just fear, although I was terrified. It was like some kind of primal recognition passed between us. Like it knew me somehow. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like it could see right through me. The moment probably only lasted a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. As we continued down the trail, I kept looking back, trying to catch another glimpse, but it had vanished without a trace. No movement, no sound. It was just gone. The rest of the hayride was a blur. I couldn't focus on anything else. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Was it real? How could something that big move so silently? Why didn't anyone else see it? When we got back to the starting point, I tried to casually ask if anyone else had noticed anything strange in the woods. They all just laughed it off, assuming I was talking about the costumed actors. No one had seen a thing. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those gleaming eyes staring back at me. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, looking for some rational explanation. But I knew what I saw. The next day, I went back to that spot in the woods. I don't know what I expected to find, footprints maybe, or some sign that it had been there. But there was nothing. The forest floor was undisturbed. If anything had been there, it didn't leave a trace. I spent weeks researching, trying to figure out what I might have seen. I came across stories of Bigfoot sightings in the area, but none of them quite matched what I experienced. This wasn't some lumbering ape man. This was something different, more intelligent, more aware. For a long time I was obsessed. I'd go hiking in those woods, hoping to catch another glimpse. I'd stay out after dark, listening for any unusual sounds, but I never saw or heard anything out of the ordinary again. As the years went by, I started to doubt myself. Maybe it had just been a trick of the light, my imagination running wild on a spooky Halloween night. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. That encounter changed me. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world we can't explain, things that exist just beyond the edge of our understanding. I still live in the area, and I still go hiking in those woods. But now, I'm always aware that I might not be alone out there. I keep my eyes and ears open, always half expecting to see that massive, silent figure watching me from the shadows. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full, I swear I can feel eyes on me. That same presence I felt that Halloween night. It's like whatever I saw is still out there, still watching, waiting. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that night, but I do know that there are mysteries in this world that we may never solve. And sometimes it's better not to look too closely at the shadows, because you never know what might be looking back. Story 7. I'll never forget that day in August 1988. I was only 9 years old, but the memory is seared into my brain like it happened yesterday. My family had decided to go camping near McCann Gulch, exploring some old abandoned mining camps in the area. I was so excited for the adventure. I loved anything to do with the Old West, and imagining what life was like for those tough miners back in the day. We'd set up our campsite in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of evergreens. Our trusty family dog, Max, was having the time of his life, running around and sniffing every tree and rock. Everything seemed perfect. On our second day there, we decided to hike up to check out one of the old mining camps we'd heard about. The trail wound its way up the mountainside, getting steeper and rougher as we climbed. I was out in front, full of energy, and eager to be the first one to spot any cool artifacts or remnants from the mining days. We'd been hiking for about an hour when I rounded a bend in the trail and froze in my tracks. There, not 50 feet away, was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. It was huge, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, and covered head to toe in long, shaggy, orangey-red hair. It was slightly hunched over, with long arms that seemed strangely human-like in proportion. For a split second, we just stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then it shifted its weight, and I caught a glimpse of its face. Dark eyes peering out from under a prominent brow, a wide, flat nose, massive jaws. It was like a nightmarish blend of human and ape. Suddenly, Max came bounding around the corner, barking excitedly. When he saw the creature, he skidded to a stop and let out the most pitiful yelp I've ever heard. His tail tucked between his legs, and he turned and ran back down the trail as fast as he could go. That snapped me out of my paralysis. I screamed at the top of my lungs and stumbled backwards, nearly falling on my butt. My parents came running up, asking what was wrong. By the time they got there, the creature had melted back into the forest. All that was left was the sound of branches cracking as it moved away. I was hysterical, crying and babbling about the monster I'd seen. My parents tried to calm me down, saying it was probably just a bear. But I knew what I'd seen. It was no bear. It walked on 2 legs. It had a face that was almost human. We practically ran back down to our campsite. I was shaking so bad I could barely walk. My dad had to carry me part of the way. When we got back, Max was there waiting for us. He was still clearly spooked, whining and staying close to us instead of running around like usual. My parents started packing up our stuff right away. They could see how terrified I was and decided we needed to cut our trip short. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole time, convinced that thing was going to come crashing out of the woods at any moment. The drive home was tense and quiet. I was too scared to sleep, jumping at every shadow we passed on the road. My mom tried to convince me it had just been my imagination running wild, but I knew the truth. What I'd seen was real. For weeks afterwards, I had horrible nightmares. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that creature was in my room, watching me from the shadows. I begged my parents to leave a light on at night. I was afraid to go outside alone, even in broad daylight. I became obsessed with trying to figure out what I'd seen. I scoured books at the library, looking for anything that matched the creature's description. When I discovered stories about Bigfoot, I was convinced that's what I'd encountered. But my parents dismissed it, saying Bigfoot was just a myth. As I got older, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it had been a bear standing on its hind legs. Maybe the red-orange color was just a trick of the light. Maybe my young mind had exaggerated its size and human-like features. But deep down, I knew none of those explanations fit. What I saw that day was something that shouldn't exist, something that defied easy categorization. I'm in my 40s now, but I still think about that day often. I've never been camping since. The thought of being out in those woods again fills me with dread. I've only told a few people about what happened. Most react with skepticism or think I'm making it up. But occasionally I'll meet someone who's had their own inexplicable encounter, and we'll share a look of understanding. They know the fear, the doubt, the way it shakes your entire worldview. I don't know if what I saw was Bigfoot, or some unknown species, or something else entirely, but I know it was real. Sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and dark, I'll find myself straining to listen for heavy footsteps or the crack of branches outside my window. Part of me hopes I'll never encounter anything like that again, but another part of me wishes I could go back to that moment, to get another look, to finally have proof that I'm not crazy, that the monster in the woods was real. That day changed me forever. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the shadows of the wilderness, defying explanation. I'll never forget the terror of that moment, the feeling of my entire reality being turned upside down. Whatever it was I saw on that mountain trail, it's out there somewhere still, and that thought both terrifies and fascinates me to this day. Story 8. I'll never forget that day in the fall of 1983. It was supposed to be just another hunting trip in Elk Valley, Idaho, but what I saw that day has haunted me for decades. I was just a young guy then, barely out of high school, and I'd been looking forward to this archery hunting trip for months. My dad and his buddies had been taking me along since I was old enough to carry a bow, and I was finally skilled enough to really contribute. We'd set out early that morning before the sun was up. The air was crisp, leaves crunching under our boots as we made our way deeper into the forest. I remember the smell of pine and damp earth, the mist hanging low in the valleys. It was quiet out there, almost eerily so. Just the occasional bird call or rustle in the underbrush. As the day wore on, we split up to cover more ground. I was with two of my dad's friends, experienced hunters who'd been coming to these woods for years. We were moving slowly, carefully, eyes peeled for any sign of elk. I was bringing up the rear, scanning the tree line, when something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just shadows playing tricks on me, but as I focused, I realized I was seeing something I couldn't explain. There, at the edge of a small clearing about 100 yards away, were 3 creatures. I hesitate to call them animals because what I saw looked far too human-like. They were tall, covered in dark brown fur, and walking upright on two legs. The tallest one was in front, and it had to be at least 8 feet tall. Behind it were two slightly smaller ones, maybe 7 feet or so. What struck me most was how they moved. It wasn't lumbering or awkward like you'd expect from a bear walking on its hind legs. No, this was smooth, purposeful movement. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I wanted to call out to the others, but my voice caught in my throat. All I could do was watch, transfixed, as these creatures made their way across the clearing. The one in front seemed to be leading the others. Every so often it would turn its head slightly, as if checking on the ones behind it. At one point, the smallest one at the back seemed to lag a bit, and the leader made a gesture with its arm, like it was motioning for it to hurry up. It was such a human-like action that I felt a chill run down my spine. I don't know how long I stood there watching. It could have been seconds or minutes. Time seemed to stand still. But then, as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone, disappearing into the thick forest on the other side of the clearing. When I finally found my voice, I called out to the others. They came running, probably thinking I'd spotted an elk. But when I tried to explain what I'd seen, the words tumbled out in a confused jumble. I was shaking, pointing wildly at the spot where the creatures had been. The older hunters exchanged looks. I could see the doubt in their eyes. They probably thought I was just an inexperienced kid who'd let his imagination run wild. But I knew what I'd seen. It wasn't a bear, wasn't any animal I'd ever encountered in these woods before. We searched the area, looking for tracks or any sign of what I'd witnessed. But the ground was hard and covered in fallen leaves. If there had been any evidence, it was long gone. As the day wore on, I could tell the others were getting frustrated with my insistence on what I'd seen. Eventually, we called it a day and headed back to camp. That night, around the campfire, I tried again to explain what I'd seen. But the more I talked, the more I could see the skepticism in their eyes. Some of them laughed it off, saying I must have dozed off and had a vivid dream. Others suggested maybe I'd seen some other hunters in the distance and my mind had played tricks on me. But I knew that wasn't true. What I'd seen wasn't human, at least not entirely. The rest of the trip was a blur. I couldn't focus on hunting anymore. Every rustle in the bushes, every shadow in the trees made me jump. I kept expecting to see those creatures again, but they never reappeared. When we got back home, I tried to research what I might have seen. This was before the internet, so I spent hours in the library, poring over books about local wildlife and folklore. Nothing quite matched what I'd witnessed. The closest thing I could find was stories about Bigfoot, but even those didn't quite fit. What I'd seen seemed more organized, more intelligent. For years, I kept quiet about what I'd seen. I'd learned quickly that most people either didn't believe me or thought I was crazy. So I buried the memory, tried to convince myself that maybe I had imagined it all. But deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't until almost 20 years later that I finally got some validation. I ran into one of the other hunters from that trip at a local diner. We got to talking about old times, and somehow the conversation turned to that day in 1983. To my shock, he leaned in close and said, "You know, I never told anyone this, but I saw them too." My heart nearly stopped. All these years, I'd thought I was alone in what I'd seen. But here was someone else, someone who'd been there, confirming my experience. He described the same scene, 3 tall, fur-covered creatures walking in a line, the leader gesturing to the one in back. It was exactly as I remembered it. We talked for hours that day, comparing notes, trying to make sense of what we'd witnessed. Neither of us had any explanation for it, but just knowing that someone else had seen it too lifted a weight off my shoulders I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. To this day, I don't know what those creatures were. I've heard all sorts of theories over the years, everything from undiscovered primates to interdimensional beings, but none of them quite fit what I saw that day in Elk Valley. All I know is that it was real, and it changed my perception of the world forever. I still go hunting sometimes, though not as often as I used to, and every time I'm in the woods, I can't help but scan the tree line, wondering if I'll ever see those creatures again. Part of me hopes I will, just to prove to myself once and for all that I'm not crazy. But another part of me is afraid of what might happen if I do. That day in 1983 opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world we can't explain, things that defy our understanding of what's possible. It's a humbling thought, and one that stayed with me all these years. I don't expect everyone to believe my story, but I know what I saw. And somewhere out there, in the forests of Idaho, I believe those creatures are still roaming, still moving with that strange, purposeful gait, still living their mysterious lives just beyond the edge of our understanding. Story 9. It was early October, prime duck season in northern Idaho. I'd driven up from Coeur d'Alene the night before, camping out in my truck to get an early start. The air was crisp, and there was frost on the ground as I set out along an old logging road just before dawn, shotgun in hand. The woods were quiet except for the crunch of my boots on the gravel. I breathed in the sharp scent of pines, alert for any movement or sound that might signal ducks. But as the sky began to lighten, I started to get an uneasy feeling. Something felt off. At first I couldn't put my finger on it. The forest just seemed too still, like all the normal woodland sounds had been muted. No birds calling, no squirrels chattering. It was putting me on edge. I'd been walking for about 20 minutes when I heard it, branches snapping somewhere off in the timber to my right. My first thought was that it must be a deer, but the sound was all wrong. Too loud, too deliberate, like something big was moving through the trees. I stopped and listened, my heart starting to race. There it was again. Crack, snap, crack. Whatever it was moving parallel to the road, keeping pace with me. A bear, maybe. But bears don't usually stalk people like that. I picked up my pace, wanting to get to the duck blind I'd set up by the river. But with each step, I could hear those noises keeping up with me just out of sight. Panic started to set in. I broke into a jog, my gear rattling. That's when I heard the scream. God, I'll never forget that sound as long as I live. It started as this deep, guttural roar that made my whole body vibrate. Then it rose in pitch to this blood-curdling shriek that echoed through the trees. It was loud, so ungodly loud, and close, maybe 100 yards away at most. I've heard plenty of animal calls in my life. Cougars, wolves, bears. This wasn't like any of them. It was almost human, but not quite. More primal, more terrifying than anything a person could produce. In that moment, my legs turned to jelly. I wanted to run, but I was frozen in place, my mind reeling as it tried to make sense of what I'd just heard. Then the crashing sounds in the forest started up again, closer this time, coming right at me. That snapped me out of it. I turned and ran flat out back the way I'd come, blind terror propelling me forward. I don't know how long I ran. Felt like miles. My lungs were on fire and my legs ached, but I didn't dare slow down. I finally reached my truck and dove inside, slamming and locking the doors. I sat there shaking, gasping for breath, straining to hear any signs of pursuit. After a few minutes of silence, I cranked the engine and peeled out of there, gravel flying. It was mid-morning by the time I got back to town. I must have looked like hell because the girl at the gas station asked if I was okay. I lied and said I was just getting over the flu. What else could I say? I barely understood what had happened myself. I've replayed that morning in my head countless times over the years, trying to rationalize it, to convince myself it was just a bear or a mountain lion. But deep down, I know it wasn't. The movement, the scream, it was something else. something that shouldn't exist. I never went back to those woods again. Gave up duck hunting altogether, if I'm being honest. Some of my buddies have tried to get me to go over the years, but I always find an excuse. They wouldn't understand. Hell, I'm not sure I understand. All I know is that there are things out there in the wilderness that defy explanation. Things that most people will go their whole lives without encountering, and sometimes I wish I could be one of those people, blissfully unaware of what's really out there. But I can't unknow what I experienced that day, can't unhear that scream. It's like a splinter in my mind, always there, always reminding me of how close I came to something. I don't know what would have happened if that thing had caught up to me on that logging road, and I thank God every day that I never had to find out. I've never told anyone the full story before, partly because I was afraid people would think I was crazy, but mostly because talking about it makes it real again. Brings back that feeling of absolute terror, of being small and helpless in the face of something ancient and unknowable. Sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and dark, I'll wake up in a cold sweat. For a split second, I'm back there in those woods, hearing that ungodly scream, and I have to remind myself that I'm safe, that it was a long time ago. But was it really? Part of me wonders if that thing is still out there, roaming the forests of northern Idaho, still screaming its otherworldly scream, still hunting. I tell myself it was just a freak encounter, a once-in-a-lifetime brush with the unknown. But then I think about all the stories of missing hikers, of strange sightings in remote areas, and I can't help but wonder if there are others out there who've had similar experiences. Others who are carrying around their own terrifying memories, too scared or too disbelieved to share them. If you're reading this and you've been through something similar, know that you're not alone. And if you haven't, count yourself lucky. There are things in this world that we're not meant to understand. Things that lurk just beyond the edges of our rational, orderly lives. I caught a glimpse of that hidden world that morning in 1987. And while part of me wishes I could forget it ever happened, another part knows that I'm changed forever. More aware, yes, but also more wary. Because now I know without a doubt that we're not alone out there in the wilderness. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the night is dark, I swear I can almost hear that scream again, carried on the breeze from some distant forest. A reminder that the unknown is always out there, always waiting, and that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 10. The camp was pretty remote, surrounded by dense forest and rugged terrain. We were there to harvest timber using helicopters, which was a pretty impressive sight to see. But when we weren't working, there wasn't much to do except explore the surrounding area. That's why I decided to go hunting one afternoon during some downtime. I grabbed my rifle and headed out into the woods, following a trail that led down towards the river. The air was crisp and the leaves were just starting to change color. It was peaceful, and I felt completely at ease as I made my way through the trees. As I got closer to the river, I slowed down and started moving more carefully, trying to stay quiet in case there was any game nearby. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow or maybe a bear standing on its hind legs. But as I focused my eyes, I realized I was looking at something I'd never seen before. It was tall, way taller than any person I'd ever met, and it was covered in dark, shaggy hair from head to toe. The creature was walking on two legs, moving with a strange, lumbering gait that was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was about 50 yards away, near the edge of the river. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen in disbelief. Then it turned and looked directly at me. I'll never forget those eyes. They were dark and intelligent, and in that moment, I felt like it was looking right into my soul. A wave of fear washed over me like nothing I'd ever experienced before. It wasn't just the normal fear you might feel when encountering a wild animal. This was different. It was primal, overwhelming, like every cell in my body was screaming at me to run, and that's exactly what I did. I turned and sprinted back towards the camp as fast as my legs could carry me. I didn't look back, didn't stop to catch my breath. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, my heart pounding in my ears. When I finally reached the camp, I bolted straight for the trailer where we slept. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, then huddled in the corner, shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't get the image of those eyes out of my head. For the next 2 days, I refused to leave the trailer. The other workers tried to coax me out, but I was too terrified. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Was it really Bigfoot? I'd heard stories, of course, but I'd always thought they were just myths. Now, I wasn't so sure. On the 3rd day, I finally gathered the courage to come out. But I wasn't the only one with a strange story to tell. Some of the other workers had made a disturbing discovery in an old, abandoned building near the camp. They'd been exploring the basement when they stumbled upon what looked like a massive nest. It was made of branches, leaves, and other forest debris, all woven together into a circular shape, big enough for something very large to sleep in. The smell in that basement was overwhelming, a strong, musky odor that made their eyes water. As they told me about it, I felt that same fear creeping back. It all fit together, the creature I'd seen, the nest, the smell. Something big was living in these woods, something that wasn't supposed to exist. For the rest of our time at that camp, things were different. We all felt on edge, like we were being watched. Strange noises in the night became more frequent. Wood knocking sounds, eerie howls that didn't sound like any animal we knew. Some of the guys even reported seeing large humanoid shapes moving at the edge of the camp at night. I never saw the creature again as clearly as I did that day by the river. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a person in a costume. It was something else entirely. Even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of that encounter. It's changed the way I look at the world, at the wilderness. There are things out there that we can't explain, things that defy our understanding of what's possible. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was just a bear, and my young mind played tricks on me. Maybe the stress of being away from home for the first time made me imagine things. But deep down, I know that's not true. What I saw that day was real, and it was not of this world as we know it. I've read about other Bigfoot encounters since then, and many of them sound eerily similar to what I experienced. The overwhelming fear, the intelligent eyes, the feeling of being watched. It's all there. And while part of me wishes I could forget that day, another part is glad I had the experience. It's opened my eyes to the possibility that there's more to this world than we understand. I don't talk about it much these days. People tend to look at you funny when you start talking about Bigfoot. But I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. And I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life. Sometimes when I'm out in the woods, I still get that feeling of being watched. And for a split second, I'll catch a glimpse of something moving just at the edge of my vision. It's probably nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But there's always that small part of me that wonders, what if? That experience at the logging camp changed me. It made me realize that the world is full of mysteries, and that sometimes the line between what we think is possible and what actually exists out there is blurrier than we'd like to admit. I often think about that creature, wonder where it is now, if it's still out there in those woods. Part of me hopes that someday someone will find definitive proof of Bigfoot's existence, but another part of me hopes it remains a mystery, because sometimes it's the things we can't explain that make life interesting. As for me, I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. Every time I hear a twig snap in the forest or catch a whiff of an unfamiliar scent on the wind, I'm right back there, 14 years old, staring into the eyes of something that shouldn't exist. And I'm reminded that in this vast, mysterious world, anything is possible. Story 11. It was early May 1996, and I had just finished up my first year teaching natural sciences at the local community college. With classes over, I was eager to get out and enjoy the spring weather. I decided to take a run on one of the fire roads up in the mountains, something I'd done countless times before without incident. The day started out perfectly normal. It was a crisp, clear morning as I drove up into the mountains. I parked at my usual spot and started my run along the winding dirt road. The only sounds were my footsteps and the occasional bird call. I was completely alone out there, or so I thought. About 30 minutes in, I slowed to catch my breath at a bend in the road. That's when I noticed something odd in the soft dirt at the edge of the path. At first I thought it was just an impression from a fallen branch, but as I got closer, my blood ran cold. There in the dirt was a massive footprint, easily 13 or 14 inches long. The shape was unmistakably that of a bare foot, but far larger than any human foot I'd ever seen. The toes were clearly defined, with what looked like sharp nails at the tips. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. A bear, maybe. But I knew bear tracks, and this was nothing like that. As I examined it closer, I noticed a second set of tracks alongside the first. These were smaller, maybe 8 or 9 inches, but with the same distinct toe shape. They were fresh too. There was still loose dirt around the edges that hadn't settled. My heart was pounding as I followed the tracks with my eyes. They led off into the dense forest on one side of the road, then re-emerged on the other side, crossing right over my own running path. Whatever made these prints had been here very recently, likely within the last hour or two. I've spent my entire career studying and teaching about the natural world. I'm not one to jump to outlandish conclusions or believe in cryptids, but in that moment, staring at those massive, unmistakably bipedal footprints, I couldn't come up with any rational explanation. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the tracks were headed in the same direction I had been running. Had this thing been following me? Was it still nearby, watching me examine its trail? Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of there. I turned and started running back towards my car, faster than I've ever run in my life. Every snapping twig or rustle in the underbrush made me flinch. I kept imagining some massive, hairy creature bursting out of the trees at any moment. When I finally reached my car, I was drenched in sweat and shaking. I fumbled with my keys, constantly glancing over my shoulder at the tree line. As soon as I got the door open, I dove inside and locked it. I sat there for several minutes, trying to calm my breathing and process what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to go back and take photos, gather evidence. The scientist in me knew how important that could be. But the primal fear coursing through me was too strong. I started the car and got out of there as fast as I could. For weeks afterwards, I was on edge. I had trouble sleeping, constantly replaying the incident in my mind. I scoured local news reports and online forums, looking for any similar sightings in the area, but there was nothing concrete. I never told anyone about what happened that day. Who would believe me? A science teacher claiming to have found Bigfoot tracks. I'd be a laughingstock. So I kept it to myself, trying my best to rationalize it away. But even now, all these years later, I can't shake the memory of those massive footprints in the dirt, the unmistakable shape, the fresh tracks crossing my path. Sometimes when I'm out in nature, I still get that feeling of being watched. I don't know what to believe anymore. All I know is that something was out there in those mountains that day, something that shouldn't exist according to everything I've studied and taught, and the thought that it might still be out there, leaving its massive tracks in the wilderness, keeps me up at night. I haven't been back to that fire road since that day. I'm not sure I ever will. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. But I'll never forget the fear I felt in that moment, realizing I wasn't alone out there. It's a reminder that even with all our scientific knowledge, nature still holds secrets we may never fully understand. Story 12. It was a scorching July afternoon in 1999. I was out in the backcountry of Cassia County, Idaho, cutting firewood like I'd done countless times before. The air was thick with the scent of pine and fresh-cut wood. I'd been at it for hours, the chainsaw buzzing rhythmically as I worked my way through a fallen tree. As the sun started to dip lower in the sky, I noticed a foul odor creeping into the air. At first, I didn't think much of it. Out here in the wilderness, you come across all sorts of smells, usually dead animals or rotting vegetation. I figured it was probably a dead cow somewhere nearby. Ranchers often lose cattle in these parts, and it's not uncommon to stumble upon their remains. But as I continued working, the smell got stronger. It was unlike anything I'd ever encountered before, a mix of wet dog, rotting meat, and something musky. It was so potent it made my eyes water. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the task at hand, but it was becoming overwhelming. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Over the roar of my chainsaw, I caught the distinct crack of a branch snapping. My instincts kicked in, and I immediately shut off the saw. The sudden silence was deafening. I scanned the area, my heart racing. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards away on a small hill was something. At first, my brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was big, much bigger than a person. It was covered in dark, matted fur, and it was walking, on 2 legs. I froze, my hand still on the chainsaw. The creature hadn't noticed me yet. It was moving slowly, almost laboriously up the hill. As it reached a large pine tree, it did something that shook me to my core. It placed its hand, not a paw, but a hand, on the trunk, like an old man steadying himself. In that moment, I could see its profile clearly. The head was large and somewhat cone-shaped, sitting directly on broad, sloping shoulders. There was no neck to speak of. Its arms were long, hanging down past its knees. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I had my rifle slung over my shoulder, and the chainsaw was right there in my hands, but the thought of confronting this thing never even crossed my mind. I was paralyzed with fear. The creature continued its slow ascent up the hill, seemingly oblivious to my presence. As it moved, I could see its muscles rippling under its fur. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. The smell was overwhelming now, and I had to fight the urge to gag. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two, the creature disappeared over the crest of the hill. Only then did I snap out of my trance. Without thinking, I grabbed my gear and ran. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, my lungs burning and my legs shaking. I sped home, my mind racing. What had I just seen? It couldn't be real, could it? But I knew what I saw. The image of that creature, its hand on the tree, was burned into my memory. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the phantom smell of it lingering in my nostrils. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? I was afraid they'd think I was crazy or on drugs. I avoided going back to that area for over a year. When I finally did return, it was with a group of friends. We didn't see anything unusual that day, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The memory of that encounter was still fresh, and every snapping twig or rustling bush made me jump. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. I've read about Bigfoot sightings, and while some details match, others don't. The creature I saw seemed older, more human-like in its movements. And that smell, I've never encountered anything like it before or since. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, there are days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw that day in the Idaho wilderness. And I know that there are things out there that defy explanation. I still cut firewood, but never alone. And I always carry a can of bear spray, though deep down, I know it probably wouldn't do much good against whatever it was I encountered that day. Some nights, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still catch a whiff of that awful smell. And I wonder, is it still out there? And what would happen if I ever came face to face with it again? I don't have answers, only questions. But one thing's for certain. That day changed me forever. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world that we can't explain, things that lurk just beyond the edges of our understanding. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we might just stumble upon them when we least expect it. Story 13. I'll never forget that day, in July 1997. It was supposed to be just another day off from my job at the Buffalo Ranch in Clark County, Idaho. I'd been working there for a few years, mostly tending to the cattle and doing general maintenance around the property. On my days off, I loved nothing more than heading down to the nearby river for some fly fishing. That morning started like any other. I woke up early, grabbed my gear, and drove out to my favorite spot along the river. The weather was perfect, sunny and warm, with just a slight breeze. I'd been fishing for a couple hours, totally relaxed and in my element. I'm a big guy, 6'6", and about 300 pounds, so I can usually handle myself in most situations. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. Around midday, some dark clouds started rolling in. I figured I'd fish for another hour or so before the rain hit. As I was casting my line, I noticed some movement out of the corner of my eye, maybe 50 yards downstream. At first I thought it was just a bear or something, hunched over near the water's edge. But then it stood up. My heart nearly stopped. This thing was massive, easily 7 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. But what really got me was the face. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen. It looked almost human, the eyes especially. They were set deep in the face, intelligent-looking, and they were staring right at me. For a few seconds, we just stood there frozen, locked in each other's gaze. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this some kind of elaborate prank, a man in a costume? But deep down, I knew this was something else entirely. Suddenly, a crack of thunder broke the silence. The creature's head snapped towards the sound, giving me a profile view. The face was broad, with a prominent brow ridge and a wide, flat nose, but it wasn't as hairy as I would have expected. The fur seemed thinner on the face, almost patchy in places. That's when the rain started, just a light drizzle at first. The creature turned back to look at me one last time, then started moving. It walked upright on 2 legs, with long, powerful strides. Its arms swung naturally at its sides. The movement was fluid, nothing like the awkward gait you'd expect from a man in a suit. As it neared the tree line, I finally snapped out of my daze. Panic set in, and I started backing away, never taking my eyes off the creature. It disappeared into a thick patch of willows, the branches swaying as it passed through. I don't remember much after that. I must have run back to my truck, because the next thing I knew, I was speeding down the dirt road back to the ranch, soaked to the bone and shaking uncontrollably. When I got back, my co-workers immediately knew something was wrong. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost. I tried to explain what happened, but the words wouldn't come. How could I describe something I couldn't even understand myself? For days after, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those piercing, intelligent eyes staring back at me. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, questioning if it had really happened. But I knew what I saw. There was no mistaking it. I've never told many people about what happened that day. Who would believe me? A Sasquatch sighting in Idaho? I'd be laughed out of town. But I know what I saw, and it wasn't human. It wasn't any animal I'd ever encountered before. In the years since, I've done some research. Turns out there have been other sightings in the area. Not many, but enough to make me feel like I'm not crazy. Some of the descriptions match what I saw. The height, the human-like face, the way it moved. I still work at the ranch, but I haven't been back to that spot on the river since that day. I can't bring myself to go there. The memory is too vivid, too terrifying. Sometimes, when I'm out checking the fences on the far side of the property, I'll get this feeling like I'm being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I can't shake the feeling that something's out there in the trees, just beyond my sight. I don't know what that creature was, or why it was there that day. Was it just passing through? Does it live in those woods? Are there more of them? These questions haunt me, even now, years later. One thing's for sure, I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. There's something out there, something that defies explanation. And for a few brief moments on that rainy July day, our worlds collided. I just hope I never have to experience anything like that again. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself wondering if it remembers me too. If somewhere out there in the vast Idaho wilderness, that creature is telling its own story about the day it encountered a human. But then I shake off those thoughts and try to forget. Because the alternative, that there's an intelligent, unknown species living right under our noses, is almost too much to comprehend. I've thought about reporting it officially, but what would be the point? Without any evidence, it's just another unbelievable story. And part of me doesn't want to draw attention to it. What if people started coming to the area trying to find it? What if they hurt it or drove it away? No, it's better to keep it to myself, to carry this secret and the weight of what I saw. But I'll never forget. The size of it, the way it moved, those eyes. It's seared into my memory forever. And every time I hear a twig snap in the woods or see a shadow move just beyond the trees, I wonder, is it out there, watching, waiting? Or was that encounter just a once-in-a-lifetime glimpse into a world we're not meant to understand? I don't have any answers. All I know is that on that day in July 1997, my entire understanding of the world changed in an instant, and nothing has been the same since. Story 14. I'll never forget that day in August 1992 near Nez Perce National Park. It was supposed to be just another peaceful summer afternoon, but what I saw changed everything I thought I knew about the world around us. I was out for a hike with my wife and kids, enjoying the fresh mountain air and beautiful scenery. We had been walking for about an hour when we decided to take a break and have some snacks. As we sat on some rocks munching on trail mix, I gazed out at the rolling hills covered in pine trees. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. About 100 yards away, descending a steep hillside, was a massive dark figure. It was clearly walking on two legs, but it moved in a way I'd never seen before. The gait was smooth yet powerful, covering ground quickly despite the uneven terrain. I blinked hard and looked again, convinced it must be a bear or some other large animal. But as I focused, I realized this was something entirely different. The creature was easily 7 feet tall, maybe more, and covered in long, shaggy dark hair from head to toe. Its arms swung at its sides as it walked, far longer than a human's would be. My heart started racing, and I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warm August day. I nudged my wife and whispered, "Do you see that?" She looked where I was pointing and gasped, grabbing onto my arm. The kids were oblivious, arguing over who got the last of the M&Ms. I didn't want to scare them, so I quietly told them to pack up their things, that it was time to head back. As we gathered our belongings, I kept my eyes locked on the creature. It continued making its way down the hillside with surprising agility for something so large. That's when it suddenly stopped and turned its head in our direction. Even from 100 yards away, I swear I could feel its gaze lock onto us. My wife let out a small whimper, and I instinctively put my arm around her and the kids, pulling them close. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, the creature stood motionless, staring right at us. I couldn't make out any facial features, but the intelligence in its posture was undeniable. This was no ordinary animal. Then, in a flash, it turned and loped off into a thicker patch of trees, quickly disappearing from view. The kids, sensing our unease, started asking what was wrong. I mumbled something about seeing a bear and that we needed to leave, ushering them quickly down the trail. As we hurried back to our car, my mind was reeling. What had we just witnessed? It couldn't be what I thought it was. Those were just stories, myths. And yet, I knew deep in my gut that we had seen something extraordinary, something that defied explanation. When we got home, I was still shaken. I called my buddy Tony, who lived nearby, to see if he had heard anything strange. To my shock, he said he and his family had seen the same thing earlier that day, also from about 100 to 120 yards away. His description matched ours exactly. A massive hair-covered creature walking upright like a man, but clearly not human. Word spread quickly through our small community. Within days, I heard that several other residents had reported similar sightings. One woman, Becky Johnson, even tried to photograph the creature, but only managed to capture a tiny black speck in the distance. The local rangers did a cursory investigation but found nothing conclusive. They chalked it up to bare sightings and overactive imaginations. But those of us who saw it knew better. This was something else entirely. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what we had seen. I found myself lying awake at night, replaying the encounter over and over in my mind. The way it moved, the intelligence in its bearing. It haunted me. I started researching similar sightings in the area and was astounded by how many reports there were going back decades. Many described the same thing we had seen, a large hair-covered bipedal creature that moved with surprising grace and speed. Some nights I would sit out on my porch, staring into the darkness of the surrounding forest. Every rustling leaf or snapping twig would make me jump, wondering if it was out there watching us. The more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that there was something living in those woods that science couldn't explain. My wife worried about my growing obsession. She urged me to let it go, to focus on our family and work. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we had glimpsed something profound that day, something that challenged everything we thought we knew about the natural world. I started going on solo hikes, hoping to catch another glimpse of the creature. I never saw it again, but I often felt like I was being watched. Sometimes I would find strange tracks or tufts of coarse hair caught on branches. Was I imagining things, or were these signs of its presence? As the years passed, the memory of that day never faded. Whenever I would mention it to others, most would laugh it off or give me skeptical looks. But occasionally I'd meet someone whose eyes would widen in recognition, and they would share their own story in hushed tones. It's been over 30 years now since that August day near Nez Perce National Park. I'm older now, my hair grey and my steps slower, but I still think about what we saw almost every day. I've never been able to fully explain it, and part of me doesn't want to. There's something comforting in knowing that there are still mysteries out there, things beyond our understanding. Sometimes when I'm out in nature, I'll catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye or hear a strange sound in the distance, and for a moment I'm transported back to that hillside, watching in awe as that massive hair-covered figure descended with inhuman grace. I don't know if I'll ever see it again or if anyone will ever prove its existence. But I know what I saw that day, and it changed me forever. There's more to this world than we can explain, and sometimes, if we're lucky, we get a glimpse of the impossible. Mine's story 15. My wife Jenny and I were trucking through Idaho, heading west towards Washington. It was late, probably around 2 a.m., and we were both exhausted. The highway was deserted, just miles of dark forest on either side. I remember thinking how creepy it felt, like anything could be hiding out there in the shadows. We were about 20 miles east of Post Falls when I noticed something weird in my side mirror. At first I thought it was just my tired eyes playing tricks, but then I saw it again, movement in the tree line, keeping pace with the truck. "Hey, Jen, you see that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She leaned over to look. "See what?" Wait, what the hell is that?" Just then, this massive dark shape burst out of the trees and onto the shoulder. I slammed on the brakes instinctively, the truck screeching to a halt. We both just sat there frozen, staring at this thing through the passenger window. It was only about 10 feet away, standing right at the edge of the road. In the headlights, I could see it clearly, and to this day, I can't explain what I saw. It looked like a man, but impossibly huge, at least 8 feet tall and built like a linebacker. But the proportions were all wrong, with long arms that hung down past its knees, and it was covered in thick, matted brown hair. The face is what got me, though. It was flat and wide, with deep-set eyes that gleamed in the light. They looked intelligent, not like an animal at all. For a second we just stared at each other, and I swear I saw curiosity in its expression. Then it turned and started moving back towards the trees. But the way it moved, my God. In 2 strides it covered ground that would have taken me 5 or 6 steps, and as it went, it just casually reached up and snapped off a thick tree branch like it was nothing. The crack echoed in the silence. I don't know how long we sat there after it disappeared into the forest. Could have been 5 minutes or an hour. We were both shaking, trying to process what we'd seen. That wasn't human," Jenny finally whispered. "What the hell was it?" I didn't have an answer. Still don't, to be honest. But I know what I saw that night. Call it Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever. That thing was real, and a hell of a lot more than just some guy in a costume. We eventually got moving again, but I white-knuckled the wheel the whole way to Post Falls. Kept expecting to see it come bursting out of the trees again. When we finally pulled into a truck stop, neither of us wanted to get out. Ended up sleeping in the cab with the doors locked. The next morning, it all felt like a bad dream. But the image of that creature was burned into my mind. Those eyes, I'll never forget them. We debated reporting it, but who would believe us? Just another crazy Bigfoot story, right? So we kept it to ourselves. Told the company we had engine trouble to explain the delay. But I know what I saw, and every time I drive that stretch of I-90 now, I can't help scanning the tree line. Part of me hopes to see it again, to prove I'm not crazy. But mostly I'm terrified of coming face to face with that thing again. I don't know if it was curious, aggressive, or just passing through, but the raw power it displayed, snapping that branch like a toothpick, I have no doubt it could have torn our truck apart if it wanted to. Why it didn't, I'll never know. Sometimes I wonder if there are more of them out there, hiding in the vast forests of the Pacific Northwest. Other truckers have stories too. Glimpses of something huge darting across the road, strange howls in the night. But nobody talks about it much. You don't want to be known as the guy who believes in Bigfoot, but I know what I saw. And sometimes, on dark nights when I'm driving alone, I swear I can feel eyes watching me from the forest, waiting, wondering. I've driven that route hundreds of times since then, never seen anything like it again. But the memory of that night has never faded. The impossible strength, the intelligent eyes, The sheer size of the creature. It was like nothing that should exist in our world. Yet there it was, as real as you and me, standing at the edge of the known, peering in at us with equal fascination. A reminder that there are still mysteries out there, things science can't explain away. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, some days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what Jenny and I saw that night. And I know that somewhere out there, in the deep woods of Idaho, there's something that defies explanation, something that watches and waits. So if you're ever driving I-90 late at night, keep your eyes on the tree line. And if you see something move, something too big to be a bear or a man, well, just keep driving. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. But me, I'll always wonder about that creature. What it was, where it came from, why it was there that night. I suppose I'll never know for sure. But I do know one thing. I'll never look at those forests the same way again. And neither would you if you'd seen what I saw. The encounter lasted maybe 2 minutes total. But those 2 minutes changed everything I thought I knew about the world. Made me question reality itself. Because if that thing could exist, what else might be out there that we don't know about? I still drive trucks, still make that run through Idaho. But now I always carry a camera, just in case. Part of me hopes I'll see it again, get proof. But mostly I hope I never lay eyes on that creature again as long as I live. Because the truth is, we're not ready for what's out there. We think we've got it all figured out, but we don't know a damn thing. That night showed me just how small and ignorant we really are. So next time you're out in the wilderness and you hear a twig snap or see a shadow move, just remember, we're not alone out here. And we're definitely not at the top of the food chain. Stay safe out there, folks, and keep watching the woods. You never know what might be watching back. Story 16. I'd been a deputy with the Adams County Sheriff's Office for about 5 years at that point. Night patrols were pretty common, especially along the main highways. That particular evening, I was cruising down US 95 with my lights and sirens on, responding to a call about some suspicious activity near a farm off the highway. The road was dark and empty, winding through dense forest. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the pavement ahead and the thick tree line on either side. I'd driven this stretch countless times before, but something felt different that night. There was an eerie stillness in the air that put me on edge. As I rounded a bend, movement caught my eye up ahead. At first I thought it was just shadows from my flashing lights, but then I saw it clearly. A massive, dark figure scrambling up the embankment on the right side of the road. My foot instinctively went to the brake pedal as I tried to process what I was seeing. This thing was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, and it was covered in dark, shaggy fur. Before I could even slow down much, the creature bounded across the road in front of me with incredible speed and agility. In 2 massive strides, it crossed both lanes and disappeared down the embankment on the other side. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching as I skidded to a stop. My heart was racing, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my body. What the hell was that? I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath and make sense of what I'd just witnessed. It had all happened so fast, but the image was seared into my mind. The way it moved was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was clearly bipedal, walking on 2 legs like a human. But no human could move with that kind of speed and power. After a few deep breaths, I grabbed my radio to call it in. But I hesitated. What was I supposed to say? That I'd just seen Bigfoot run across the highway? They'd think I was crazy or playing some kind of joke. I decided to get out and investigate. Grabbing my flashlight, I cautiously exited the cruiser. The night was eerily quiet now, with only the faint hum of crickets in the distance. I swept my light across the road, looking for any signs of the creature. There on the asphalt, I saw them, massive footprints, easily 15 inches long. They were only partial prints, but I could make out what looked like toes. A chill ran down my spine as I followed the tracks to the embankment. The slope was steep and covered in dense underbrush. Whatever this thing was, it had torn through the foliage like it was nothing. Broken branches and disturbed earth marked its path down the hillside. I was about to head down to investigate further when a smell hit me, an overwhelming stench of rotting meat and decay. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I'd encountered some foul odors in my line of work before, but nothing like this. My instincts were screaming at me to get out of there. Every hair on my body was standing on end. I quickly retreated to my cruiser, keeping my flashlight trained on the tree line. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that hulking figure emerge from the shadows. When I got back to the station, I debated whether or not to file a report. I knew how it would sound. Deputy claims to see Bigfoot on highway patrol. I'd be the laughingstock of the department, but I couldn't just ignore what I'd seen. I ended up filing a vague report about a large animal crossing the road, leaving out the more fantastic details. My supervisor gave me a strange look when I turned it in, but didn't press me for more information. In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself returning to that stretch of highway, searching for any further signs of the creature. I never saw it again, but there were other strange occurrences. Local farmers reported their livestock acting strangely, cattle huddling together in the corners of their pastures, refusing to graze in certain areas. There were more reports of that horrific stench, always accompanied by an unsettling quiet in the woods. I started talking to some of the old-timers in the area, and it turns out there had been whispers of something strange in those woods for generations. They spoke of massive footprints found deep in the forest, of eerie howls echoing through the mountains at night. To this day, I'm not sure exactly what I saw that night, but I know it wasn't a bear or any other animal native to Idaho. The way it moved, the intelligence in its actions, it was something else entirely. I've replayed that encounter in my mind countless times over the years. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember the footprints on the road, the broken foliage on the embankment, that god-awful smell. It was real, whatever it was. I retired from the sheriff's office a few years back, but I still live in the area. And every now and then, when I'm driving down US 95 late at night, I find myself scanning the tree line. My hands grip the steering wheel a little tighter, and I can't help but wonder, is it still out there, watching and waiting in the darkness? I may never know for sure what I encountered that night, but one thing's certain, it changed me forever. I no longer dismiss the stories of strange creatures in the woods, because I know firsthand, sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. Story 17. I'll never forget that camping trip in Clearwater County back in October '95. My buddy Jake and I had been planning it for weeks, eager to get away from the daily grind and enjoy some time in nature before winter set in. We packed up my old Chevy pickup and headed out early on the 28th, excited for a weekend of fishing and relaxing by the campfire. The drive out was beautiful, with the fall colors in full display. We found a nice secluded spot to set up camp near a small stream, surrounded by towering pines and aspens. As we unloaded our gear and got the tent set up, I remember feeling so at peace. The crisp autumn air, the sound of the stream bubbling nearby, the golden sunlight filtering through the trees. It was perfect. We spent the afternoon fishing and exploring the area a bit before settling in around the campfire as evening fell. Jake and I were catching up over a couple beers, swapping stories and cracking jokes like we always did. Everything felt so normal, so calm. I had no idea how drastically things were about to change. It was probably around 9 or 10 p.m. when we first heard it. A deep, guttural bellow echoing through the trees. At first I thought it might be a moose or elk, but something about the sound sent a chill down my spine. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Jake and I exchanged uneasy glances. "What the hell was that?" he asked. I shrugged, trying to play it cool. Probably just some animal, nothing to worry about. But as the night wore on, the sounds continued. Sometimes it was that same bellowing cry, other times more of a high-pitched whoop or howl, and it seemed to be getting closer. We tried to keep our conversation going, to act like everything was fine, but I could tell we were both on edge. I kept glancing out into the darkness beyond our little circle of firelight, straining my eyes and ears. Then I saw it. Just for a split second, a massive dark shape moving between the trees maybe 50 yards away. My heart started racing. "Jake," I whispered, "did you see that?" He nodded, eyes wide. "What the fuck was it? A bear?" I shook my head. Too big for a bear, and the shape was all wrong. Whatever I'd glimpsed had been walking upright, with long arms swinging at its sides. A chill ran down my spine as I realized how much the silhouette had resembled a person. An enormous, impossibly tall person. We sat in tense silence for a while, both of us scanning the tree line. The sounds had stopped, but I could feel eyes watching us from the darkness. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. After what felt like hours, Jake whispered, "Maybe we should pack up and get out of here." I was tempted to agree, but the thought of trying to break camp and navigate those dark forest roads in the middle of the night terrified me even more. "Let's wait till morning," I said. "We've got the fire, and the truck's right here if we need to make a quick getaway." Jake nodded reluctantly. We decided to take turns keeping watch through the night. I took first shift while he tried to get some sleep in the tent. I sat rigid by the fire, flashlight in one hand and my hunting knife in the other, jumping at every little sound. About an hour into my watch, I heard heavy footsteps circling our campsite, just beyond the reach of the firelight. My hand shook as I swept the flashlight beam back and forth, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. For a second, I thought I saw two glowing eyes reflecting the light, one with a greenish-blue tint, the other more reddish. But then they were gone. I was about to wake Jake when suddenly an ear-splitting roar erupted from just beyond the trees. I yelled in shock, scrambling backwards. Jake came rushing out of the tent. "What's happening?" Before I could answer, a massive shape came lumbering into view at the edge of our campsite. Even in the dim firelight, I could make out its features. It stood at least 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. But its face, God, its face. It was like a twisted parody of a human face, with a heavy brow, a wide flat nose, and a mouth full of yellowed teeth frozen in a grimace. Its eyes locked onto us, and I felt my blood turn to ice. Those eyes were terrifyingly intelligent, filled with a mixture of curiosity and malice. For a long moment we all just stared at each other, frozen. Then Jake grabbed the spotlight from the truck and shone it directly at the creature. It let out an inhuman shriek and threw its massive arms up to shield its eyes. In that moment of confusion, Jake and I dove into the truck. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get them in the ignition. The creature was recovering, lowering its arms and taking a step towards us. Finally, the engine roared to life. I slammed it into reverse and gunned it, not even caring about our abandoned gear. Rocks and branches crunched under the tires as I whipped the truck around. In the rearview mirror, I caught one last glimpse of the thing standing in our campsite, silhouetted against the dying fire. Then we were tearing down the bumpy forest road, both of us breathing hard. We drove for hours, not stopping until we hit the main highway. Neither of us spoke much. What was there to say? We'd seen something that shouldn't exist, something that defied explanation. Part of me wanted to just forget the whole thing, to convince myself it had all been some kind of shared hallucination. But I knew what I'd seen, and apparently, so did Jake. The next morning, against my better judgment, we went back to the campsite to retrieve our abandoned gear. Everything was exactly as we'd left it. The smouldering remains of the fire, our flattened tent, food wrappers scattered around. Everything except the trees at the edge of the clearing. Several of the white birch saplings had been twisted and bent, their trunks nearly snapped in half. It was as if something immensely strong had grabbed them and wrenched them aside like blades of grass. The marks were fresh, the exposed wood still oozing sap. We gathered our stuff in tense silence and got the hell out of there. On the drive home, Jake finally spoke up. "We can't tell anyone about this," he said quietly. "They'd think we were crazy or attention-seeking liars." I nodded in agreement, and for years we kept it to ourselves. But the memory of that night has haunted me ever since. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of that inhuman roar ringing in my ears. I've never been camping again. Hell, I can barely bring myself to go for a hike in the woods anymore. I don't know what we encountered that night in Clearwater County. Some kind of undiscovered primate, an escaped research subject, something else entirely. I'll probably never know for sure. But I do know this. There are things out there in the wilderness that defy explanation, things that most people will go their whole lives without ever glimpsing. And sometimes ignorance really is bliss. To this day, I can't shake the memory of those eyes staring at me from the darkness, intelligent, curious, and hungry. Whatever that creature was, it wasn't just some dumb animal. It knew exactly what it was doing. And I have a feeling it's still out there somewhere, waiting in the shadows of the forest for its next encounter with the human world. I often wonder if anyone else has seen it since that night. Part of me hopes not. I wouldn't wish that terror on anyone. But another part of me hopes that someday, somehow, the truth will come out. That the world will finally have to acknowledge the existence of these mysterious creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of civilization. Until then, I'll keep telling my story. Not for attention or fame, but because people need to know the truth. They need to understand that there are still mysteries out there, still unknowns lurking in the dark corners of the world, and maybe, just maybe, my experience will help someone else make sense of their own inexplicable encounter someday. So, if you're planning a camping trip in Clearwater County, or really anywhere off the beaten path, be careful. Be aware of your surroundings. And if you hear strange noises in the night or catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there, well, you might just be better off packing up and getting the hell out of there. Trust me on this one. Story 18. That morning, Dad left early to scout for deer trails. I was supposed to stay at camp and keep an eye on things. Being a typical teenager, I got bored pretty quickly. I decided to explore a bit, figuring I'd be back before Dad even noticed I was gone. I wandered towards the old mine, curious about its history. The whole area had this eerie, abandoned feel to it. Rusted equipment and weathered buildings were scattered around, nature slowly reclaiming what man had left behind. It was fascinating and a little creepy at the same time. As I approached one of the old buildings, movement caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a bear. We'd been warned about them in the area, so I froze, trying to remember what you're supposed to do in a bear encounter. But as I watched, something felt off. The creature was walking on two legs, but not like a person. Its gait was awkward, almost shambling. It was covered in dark, matted fur, and it was huge, way bigger than any man I'd ever seen. My brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't move like a bear, but it sure as hell wasn't human. Then it turned and looked directly at me. I'll never forget those eyes. They weren't animal eyes, vacant and instinctive. There was an intelligence there, a awareness that sent chills down my spine. For a split second, we just stared at each other. Then pure, primal fear took over. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. I kept expecting to feel a massive hand grab me from behind, but I didn't dare look back. I just ran and ran until I reached our trailer. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the door open. Once inside, I locked it and huddled in the far corner, trying to catch my breath. I kept replaying what I'd seen in my mind, trying to make sense of it, but nothing about that creature made sense. Hours passed. I jumped at every sound outside the trailer, convinced that thing was out there, watching, waiting. When my dad finally came back, I was too scared to even open the door for him. He had to talk to me through the window for a good 15 minutes before I calmed down enough to let him in. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words came out in a jumbled mess. I was crying and shaking, and I think my dad thought I was having some kind of breakdown. He tried to convince me it was just a bear, that I'd let my imagination run wild. But I knew what I saw. Those eyes. They weren't a bear's eyes. I refused to leave the trailer. For 2 whole days I stayed locked inside, barely eating or sleeping. My dad was worried sick, but I couldn't bring myself to go back out there. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature staring at me. On the 3rd day, my dad convinced me we needed to head home. He said I was too shaken up to continue the hunting trip. As we were packing up, a couple of other hunters came by our camp. They looked pretty shaken up too. They told us they'd found something strange in the basement of one of the old buildings, the same one where I'd seen the creature. They described a massive nest, made of branches and leaves, big enough for something much larger than a person. The smell, they said, was overwhelming, a mix of wet fur, musk, and something else they couldn't identify. As they were describing it, I felt the blood drain from my face. My dad noticed and quickly changed the subject, but the damage was done. What I'd seen was real. It wasn't just in my head. The drive home was tense and quiet. I could tell my dad was struggling to make sense of everything. He kept glancing at me, opening his mouth like he wanted to say something, then thinking better of it. I think he was scared too, but didn't want to admit it. When we got home, life went on. School, friends, normal teenage stuff. But I was different. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I had nightmares for months, always waking up in a cold sweat. The image of those intelligent, inhuman eyes burned into my mind. I tried to research what I might have seen. I came across stories of Bigfoot and Sasquatch, but none of them quite matched what I'd encountered. The creature I saw wasn't some gentle forest giant. It was something else, something that didn't belong in our world. As the years passed, the memory faded a bit, but it never fully went away. I've never been comfortable in the woods since then. Every snapping twig or rustling bush sends my heart racing. I've tried to convince myself it was just a bear, that I was a kid with an overactive imagination. But deep down, I know the truth. Something was out there in Garden Valley, something that shouldn't exist. And sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and dark, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching, waiting. And I pray that I never encounter it again. I've never told this story to anyone besides my dad. Even now, as I type this out, my hands are shaking, but I needed to share it. Maybe someone else out there has seen it too. Maybe I'm not crazy, or maybe putting this out there will help me finally move on from that terrifying day in October, all those years ago. But one thing's for sure, I'll never set foot in Garden Valley again. Some things are better left alone, hidden in the shadows of abandoned mines and forgotten logging camps. And if you ever find yourself in those woods and feel like something's watching you, run. Run, and don't look back, because what's out there isn't something from our world, and you don't want it to catch you. Story 19. I still remember that summer like it was yesterday, even though it's been decades now. My buddy Jake and I had driven up to this secluded lake near McCall, Idaho for a weekend fishing trip. We were both in our early 20s at the time, full of that youthful overconfidence, you know. Thought we were invincible and knew everything. The lake was beautiful, nestled up in the mountains and surrounded by dense forest. We'd been having a great day, caught a bunch of trout, drank a few beers. As evening started to roll in, we noticed some dark clouds gathering on the horizon. Should have taken that as our cue to pack up, but we figured we had time for a few more casts. Big mistake. That storm came in fast and hit hard. Within minutes, the sky went from dusky twilight to pitch black. Rain was coming down in sheets, thunder booming so loud it felt like it was rattling my bones. We scrambled to gather our gear, but it was tough in the darkness and downpour. Jake was shouting something about heading back to the truck, but I could barely hear him over the storm. I clicked on my flashlight, and we started making our way through the woods, hoping we were going the right direction. The beam of light wasn't much help. It just made the raindrops look like static and cast weird, jumping shadows among the trees. We'd been stumbling along for maybe 10 minutes when Jake grabbed my arm, stopping me in my tracks. At first I thought he'd seen the truck, but then I followed his gaze off to our right and felt my heart skip a beat. There, maybe 30 yards away, were two glowing green eyes staring right at us from the darkness. They were huge and set way too high off the ground to be any normal animal. Had to be 7 or 8 feet up at least. For a second we both just froze. Then Jake let out this nervous laugh and said, "Huh, must be a bear or something. Let's get out of here." But even as he said it, I could hear the doubt in his voice. We both knew bears don't have glowing eyes like that. We picked up our pace, trying to put some distance between us and whatever that thing was. But every time I glanced back, those eyes were still there, keeping pace with us. It was moving silently through the underbrush, just out of reach of my flashlight beam. All I could make out was a vague, hulking shape. Jake was getting pretty freaked out by this point. He kept saying we should yell at it, try to scare it off. But something in my gut told me that was a bad idea. This thing, whatever it wasn't scared of us. It was stalking us. We came to a small clearing, and Jake stopped suddenly. He turned to face where we'd last seen the eyes and shouted, "Hey, get out of here!" His voice cracked a bit at the end. For a moment, nothing happened. Then those eyes appeared at the edge of the clearing, much closer now. And as a flash of lightning lit up the sky, I caught a glimpse of the creature they belonged to. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall and covered in dark, matted fur. But what really got me were its facial features. They were almost human-like. A broad, flat nose, a heavy brow, and those glowing green eyes, filled with an intelligence that sent chills down my spine. Jake saw it too. I heard him let out a strangled gasp beside me. We both stood there, paralyzed with fear, as this thing just stared at us. It felt like hours, but was probably only a few seconds. Then another lighting flash, and it was gone, vanished back into the shadows like it had never been there. That broke the spell. We ran. Full tilt sprint through the woods, branches whipping our faces, stumbling over roots and rocks. I lost my flashlight at some point, but we didn't stop to look for it. We just ran blindly until we literally crashed into Jake's truck. We peeled out of there so fast we left rubber on the dirt road. Didn't say a word to each other the whole drive back to town. What was there to say? We both knew what we'd seen, but it didn't make any sense. I tried to convince myself it was just a bear, or maybe a moose. Some rational explanation. But deep down, I knew better. Nothing in those woods should have been that big, should have moved that quietly, should have had eyes like that. For years afterwards, I didn't tell anyone about what happened that night. Jake and I kind of had an unspoken agreement not to bring it up. It was easier to pretend it never happened, you know. But then, about 5 years ago, Jake called me out of the blue, said his dad had passed away recently, and while going through his things, he'd found an old journal. In it was an entry from the summer of 1943, exactly 40 years before our trip. Jake's dad had been fishing at that same lake, and he'd seen the exact same thing we had, a massive, ape-like creature with glowing green eyes silently stalking him through the woods. Reading that, it brought it all flooding back. The fear, the confusion, the feeling of unreality. But it also brought a strange sort of relief, knowing we weren't crazy, that someone else had seen it too. I've done a lot of research since then, trying to figure out what it could have been. Came across stories of Bigfoot sightings in that area going back decades. Some folks say it's just folklore, but I know what I saw, what Jake saw, what his dad saw 40 years before us. There's something out there in those Idaho woods, something that shouldn't exist but does, and sometimes on stormy nights, I still wake up in a cold sweat, those glowing green eyes haunting my dreams. I haven't been back to that lake since that night. Part of me wants to prove to myself that it really happened, maybe even see that creature again. But a bigger part of me is terrified of what I might find if I did go back. Some things, once seen, can't be unseen, and some mysteries, maybe, are better left unsolved. All I know for sure is that night changed me, made me realize the world is a lot bigger, a lot stranger than we like to think. There are things out there beyond our understanding, beyond what science can explain. And sometimes, if you're not careful, you might just stumble across one of them in the dark woods on a stormy night. So if you're ever up in those mountains near McCall and you see a storm rolling in, maybe think twice about sticking around. You never know what might be watching you from the shadows. And trust me, once you've seen those eyes, you'll never forget them. Story 20. We'd spent the day poking around the abandoned buildings in Campfire, imagining what life must have been like there back in its heyday. As the sun started to set, we decided to head back to our campsite at McCann Gulch. The walk back was about a mile through the woods. At first, everything seemed normal. Rusty was trotting along happily, sniffing everything in sight. My dad was telling some corny jokes that had my mum rolling her eyes. But then Rusty's ears perked up and he started growling softly. "What is it, boy?" my dad asked, peering into the growing darkness. There was a rustling sound coming from some bushes off to our right. My dad told Rusty to go check it out, thinking it was probably just a rabbit or something. Rusty bounded over, tail wagging. But as soon as he got close to the bushes, Rusty let out the most blood-curdling yelp I've ever heard. He came tearing back to us, whimpering and shaking all over. I'd never seen him act like that before. That's when I saw it. Just for a second, illuminated by the last rays of sunlight filtering through the trees, a massive figure, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in reddish-orange fur. It was walking upright on 2 legs, parallel to our path about 50 yards away. I froze in terror, unable to speak or move. My mom must have seen my face because she grabbed my arm and whispered, "What's wrong, honey?" I managed to point shakily in the direction of the creature. My parents both looked, but it had already disappeared into the shadows. I saw something," I stammered. It was huge and hairy and walking on 2 legs. My dad tried to play it cool, but I could tell he was spooked. "It was probably just a bear," he said, not sounding very convinced. "Let's pick up the pace and get back to camp." We practically ran the rest of the way, Rusty whimpering and sticking close to our heels the whole time. As soon as we got back to our campsite, my dad grabbed his rifle and made us all pile into the tent. I was too scared to sleep. Every little sound outside made me jump. At one point, I swear I heard heavy footsteps circling our campsite. Rusty was still shaking, his ears constantly swiveling towards every noise. My dad set up an impromptu alarm system, tying empty cans to a string and circling our tent. He said it was just in case any animals wandered into camp, but I knew he was worried about something much bigger than a raccoon. We barely slept that night. As soon as the sun came up, we packed up camp in record time and got the hell out of there. The whole drive home, my parents kept trying to convince themselves, and me, that it was just a bear we'd seen. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before or since. The image of that massive, fur-covered figure is seared into my brain. For years afterwards, I had nightmares about that creature chasing me through dark woods. I became obsessed with researching Bigfoot and other cryptids, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night near Campfire. Was it really Bigfoot, some other undiscovered creature, or just my overactive childhood imagination combined with the spooky atmosphere of the ghost town? All I know is I've never felt comfortable camping since then. The sound of rustling leaves at night still sends a chill down my spine, and sometimes, when I'm driving through rural areas at dusk, I find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that hulking figure emerge from the shadows once again. I've told this story to a few people over the years, but most just laugh it off or try to explain it away. I get it. If I hadn't been there myself, I probably wouldn't believe it either. But I know what I saw that night, and no matter how many years pass, I'll never forget the pure terror I felt in that moment. Sometimes I wonder if that creature is still out there, roaming the forests around Campfire. Part of me hopes I'll never know for sure, but another part of me is still that curious 9-year-old, longing for proof that what I saw was real. I've thought about going back to Campfire as an adult, to see if I can find any evidence or maybe even catch another glimpse. But every time I seriously consider it, I remember Rusty's terrified yelp and the way he shook all night. Whatever that thing was, it scared a tough old dog half to death, and that's enough to keep me far away from those woods. I know this all probably sounds crazy. Trust me, there are times I've questioned my own sanity over this, but I know deep down that what I experienced that night was real. It may not fit neatly into our understanding of the natural world, but that doesn't make it any less true. Sometimes late at night when the house is quiet and dark, I find myself replaying that moment in my mind. The rustling in the bushes, Rusty's panicked reaction, and then that massive, fur-covered figure emerging from the shadows. In those moments, the fear feels as fresh as it did back in 1988. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was just a large bear standing on its hind legs. Maybe the fading light and my overactive imagination turned a normal animal into something monstrous, but none of those explanations ever quite fit. They don't account for Rusty's extreme reaction or the distinctly humanoid way the creature moved. One thing that's always stuck with me is how quickly and silently it disappeared. 1 second it was there, clearly visible despite the growing darkness, and the next it was gone without a trace. No sound of snapping twigs or rustling leaves. It was as if it had simply melted back into the forest. I've often wondered if anyone else has had similar experiences in that area. I've scoured local newspapers from that time, looking for any reports of strange sightings or unexplained phenomena around Campfire. But I've never found anything concrete. Sometimes I think about reaching out to cryptozoologists or Bigfoot researchers, sharing my story with them. But then I imagine the skepticism, the probing questions, the implication that I might be making it all up or misremembering, and I decide to keep it to myself. The truth is, I don't know what I saw that night. I can't explain it, can't fit it into any neat category of known animals. All I know is that it was real, it was terrifying, and it changed me forever. That camping trip was supposed to be a fun family adventure, a chance to explore a piece of local history. Instead, it became a brush with the unknown that's haunted me for decades. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding. I still love nature and the outdoors, but now, whenever I'm in the wilderness, there's always a part of me on high alert, watching the shadows, listening for any out-of-place sounds, because I know firsthand that sometimes the monsters from our nightmares turn out to be all too real. Story 21. I was just a teenager back in '92, living with my folks near Nez Perce National Forest. It was a quiet area, not much happening most days. But that summer, something happened that I still can't explain to this day. It was a hot August afternoon. I remember because the air felt thick and heavy, like it does before a thunderstorm. My dad and I were driving back from a fishing trip, taking the long way home along this winding mountain road. We hadn't caught much, just a couple small trout, but it had been nice to get out of the house. As we came around a bend, my dad suddenly slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded a bit on the gravel. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, squinting through the windshield. At first I didn't see anything, but then I noticed movement on the steep hillside to our right, maybe 300-400 feet away. Something big and dark was making its way down the slope. "Is it a bear?" I asked, leaning forward in my seat. My dad shook his head slowly. "No, it's walking on two legs." As I stared, I started to make out more details. Whatever it was huge, way bigger than any person I'd ever seen. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, probably more, and it was covered in dark, shaggy hair from head to toe. The way it moved was so strange. It wasn't lumbering like a bear would. Its gait was smooth but awkward, like it wasn't quite used to walking upright. Long arms swung at its sides as it picked its way down the hill. My heart was pounding. I fumbled for the disposable camera in the glove box, but my hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold it steady. "We got to get a picture of this," I said, my voice coming out higher than normal. My dad nodded, not taking his eyes off the hillside. He inched the truck forward a bit to get a better angle. I snapped a few photos in quick succession, praying at least one would turn out clear. The creature didn't seem to notice us. It just kept steadily making its way down towards the tree line at the bottom of the slope. We sat there watching it for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two. Neither of us spoke. I don't think we even breathed. Just as it reached the edge of the forest, the thing paused. For a moment I could have sworn it turned its head and looked right at us. A chill ran down my spine. Then it melted into the shadows between the trees and vanished. My dad and I sat in stunned silence for a long time after it disappeared. Finally, he cleared his throat. Did you see that?" he asked quietly. I nodded, still staring at the spot where it had been. "Yeah, what was it?" He shook his head. "I don't know, son. I really don't know." We drove home in silence, both lost in our own thoughts. As soon as we got back, I rushed to get the film developed. But when I got the photos back a week later, my heart sank. All you could see was a tiny black speck against the brown hillside. It could have been anything: a bear, a shadow, a smudge on the lens. There was no way to tell it was the creature we'd seen. In the days that followed, we found out we weren't the only ones who had seen something strange that day. Our neighbor Becky said she'd spotted a similar creature while out hiking. A family that lived down the road reported seeing it too, describing it almost exactly like we had. Massive, hair-covered, walking on two legs. For weeks, it was all anyone in town could talk about. Some folks were convinced it was a Bigfoot. Others thought it must have been a bear, maybe one that was sick or injured. A few people even suggested it could have been someone in a costume, playing a prank. I don't know what it was we saw that day. But I know it wasn't a bear, and it sure as hell wasn't a person in a suit. The way it moved, the sheer size of it. It was like nothing I've ever seen before or since. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember the look on my dad's face, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. He saw it too. We both did. In the years since, I've read about other Bigfoot sightings, looked at grainy photos and shaky video footage. None of it comes close to capturing what we witnessed, the raw power and strangeness of that creature. It's burned into my memory. I've never told many people about what happened. Who would believe it? But every time I drive down that road, I find myself scanning the hillside, half expecting to see that massive, hair-covered figure again. It's been over 30 years now, but I still get chills thinking about it. Whatever it was we saw that day, it wasn't supposed to exist. It was something straight out of a nightmare or a prehistoric era. And yet, there it was, right in front of us in broad daylight. I don't know if I'll ever be able to explain what we encountered, but I know what I saw, and I know that somewhere out there, in the deep forests and lonely mountains, there are things that defy explanation, things that most people will go their whole lives without ever seeing. Part of me wishes I could forget that day, go back to when the world made sense and monsters were just stories. But another part of me is glad I saw it. It's a reminder that there's still mystery in the world, still things we don't understand. I don't go fishing much anymore, and when I do, I stick to lakes and well-traveled paths. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself looking out the window towards the mountains. And I wonder if it's still out there, that impossible creature, moving silently through the wilderness just beyond the reach of civilization. I may never know for sure what we saw that day, but I know it changed me. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there's more to this world than we realize, and that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 22. As I maneuvered the big rig into the dimly lit parking area, my headlights swept across the tree line at the edge of the lot. That's when I saw it, a massive dark shape standing just inside the tree line, barely 10 feet away. At first I thought it was a bear, but as I slowed to a stop and got a better look, I realized this was no ordinary animal. The creature was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, and covered in thick dark fur. It was standing upright on 2 legs, with arms that hung down almost to its knees. The face was flat and ape-like, with deep-set eyes that reflected red in my headlights. I froze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. "Holy shit," I whispered. "Do you see that?" My wife leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. Her eyes went wide, and she let out a small gasp. "What is that thing?" she hissed. I shook my head, unable to speak. The creature just stood there, motionless, staring right at us. I had the unsettling feeling it was studying us, trying to figure out what we were. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, it slowly raised one massive arm and reached out towards a thick pine branch next to it. With a casual flick of its wrist, it snapped the 4-inch thick branch clean off the tree, like it was nothing more than a twig. The loud crack echoed through the quiet night, and I flinched involuntarily. My wife grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Start the truck," she said urgently. "We need to get out of here." I fumbled for the keys with shaking hands, but before I could turn the ignition, the creature took a step forward into the light. Now I could see it clearly, the broad, sloping forehead, the heavy brow ridge, the wide nose and mouth. This was no bear, no known animal. This was something else entirely. It tilted its head, regarding us with what almost looked like curiosity. Then it lifted the broken branch, waving it slowly back and forth, as if testing its weight. Without warning, it suddenly gripped the branch with both hands and snapped it in half like a toothpick. The The display of raw strength made my blood run cold. "Oh, God," my wife whimpered. "What is it going to do?" I finally managed to get the key in the ignition, but I hesitated to start the engine. Some instinct told me that any sudden movement might provoke the creature. So we sat there, hardly daring to breathe, locked in a silent standoff with this impossible being. After what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two, the creature lowered the broken branches and cocked its head to the side, as if listening to something. Then, with startling speed for its size, it whirled around and loped off into the darkness of the forest. I could hear branches snapping and cracking as it moved away, testament to its incredible strength. As soon as it disappeared from view, I cranked the engine and peeled out of that rest stop as fast as I could. My wife and I didn't speak for a long time, both of us trying to process what we'd just witnessed. When we finally started talking about it, we realized how lucky we were. That thing could have easily flipped our truck or ripped the doors off if it wanted to. But it didn't seem aggressive, just curious. I've been a trucker for over 30 years, and I've seen some strange things out on the road at night, but nothing comes close to what I saw that night in Idaho. I know it sounds crazy, but I swear on my life it's true. That was no man in a suit, no known animal. To this day, I'm convinced we had a close encounter with the Sasquatch. I reported it to the local authorities the next day, but they just laughed it off as some drunk's hallucination. But I know what I saw. My wife and I both saw it clear as day. That image of it snapping those thick branches like twigs is burned into my memory. The sheer power of the creature was terrifying. For months afterwards, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see those glowing red eyes staring at me through the windshield. I started taking daytime routes whenever possible, too spooked to drive those dark forest roads at night. My wife refused to come on long hauls with me for a long time after that. I've done some research since then, trying to make sense of what we saw. Turns out there have been other sightings in that area over the years, loggers, hikers, even some local residents reporting similar creatures. Most people don't believe it, of course. Hell, I wouldn't believe it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But I know what I saw that night. And I know that somewhere out there in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, there are things that defy explanation. Things that most people write off as legend or myth. But they're real. And they're out there, watching us from the shadows. I still drive that route sometimes, though I always make sure to pass through that area in broad daylight now. Every time I do, I can't help but scan the tree line, half expecting to see that massive shape standing there. Part of me hopes I never see it again. But another part of me is oddly curious, wanting to know more about these mysterious creatures that share our world. One thing's for certain. That encounter changed me. It opened my eyes to the fact that there's still so much we don't understand about the world around us. There are things out there that science can't explain, that most people will never see or believe in, but they're real. And that night in December 1988, I came face to face with one of them. I don't expect everyone to believe my story. Hell, sometimes I still have trouble believing it myself. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget that night for as long as I live. The night I looked into the eyes of a legend and lived to tell the tale. Story 23. I was only 2 years old when it happened, but the memories are seared into my mind like they were yesterday. It was a crisp autumn day in 1867, the trees ablaze with fiery reds and golds. My father, Henry Flynn, was a lumberjack and bear hunter in Custer, Michigan. That fateful day, he took me with him into the woods, something he'd done many times before. We hiked up to the top of a hill, the fallen leaves crunching beneath our feet. Dad was tracking a bear, his rifle at the ready. He told me to stay put while he scouted ahead. "Don't move from this spot, Katie," he said sternly. "I'll be right back." I nodded obediently, plopping down on a fallen log. Dad disappeared into the trees, and I sat there quietly, watching a butterfly flit by. But as the minutes ticked by, I grew restless. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows lengthening as the sun dipped lower. Where was Dad? Panic began to set in. That's when I heard the low growl. I whipped my head around and froze. There, not 20 feet away, was the biggest bear I'd ever seen. It was massive, with thick brown fur and eyes that seemed to bore right through me. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or cry out. The bear lumbered towards me, sniffing the air. I squeezed my eyes shut, sure I was about to be eaten. But instead of sharp claws or teeth, I felt something warm and soft nudge my arm. I cracked open one eye to see the bear gently nosing me, almost curiously. Before I knew what was happening, the bear had scooped me up in its mouth, cradling me as gently as a mother cat with her kitten. I was too shocked to struggle or scream as it carried me deeper into the forest. We traveled for what felt like hours, the bear moving with surprising grace for such a large creature. Eventually, we came to a small cave, where the bear deposited me on a bed of leaves. I huddled there, shivering with cold and fear as night fell. But the bear didn't leave me. It curled its massive body around mine, enveloping me in warmth. I fell into an exhausted sleep, lulled by the bear's steady breathing. The next few days passed in a blur. The bear would leave periodically, always returning with berries or fish for me to eat. It seemed to understand that I needed food, even if it wasn't what a bear cub would typically eat. When I cried from hunger or fear, the bear would nuzzle me gently, almost comfortingly. One particularly cold night, I awoke to find the bear carefully placing leaves over me like a blanket. It was then that I realized this creature wasn't trying to hurt me. It was protecting me, caring for me as if I were its own cub. During the day, the bear would take me on short walks through the forest. It seemed to be showing me its world, the burbling streams, the towering trees, the hidden berry patches. Once, it even let me ride on its back as it lumbered through a meadow. Despite my fear and confusion, I found myself giggling at the sensation. I don't know how many days passed like this. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that primeval forest. But eventually, I heard distant shouts. The bear's ears pricked up, and it growled low in its throat. Scooping me up once again, it began to move swiftly through the trees. The shouts grew louder, and I recognized my father's voice among them. "Katie! Katie! Where are you?" Tears sprang to my eyes at the sound. The bear hesitated, seeming to sense my reaction. It set me down gently in a small clearing, then melted back into the shadows of the forest. Moments later, a group of lumberjacks burst into the clearing, led by my frantic father. His face was haggard with worry, his clothes torn and dirty. When he saw me, he let out a choked sob and swept me up in his arms. "Katie, oh my God, Katie," he repeated over and over, crushing me to his chest. The other men crowded around, exclaiming in wonder at finding me alive and unharmed. As Dad carried me back through the forest, I peered over his shoulder. There, just visible in the shadows, I saw the bear watching us go. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I felt a wave of something. Gratitude, understanding. I'm not sure, but in that moment, I knew the bear had saved my life. Back home, the story of my rescue spread like wildfire. People marveled at how a wild bear had cared for a human child, keeping me safe and warm for days. Some called it a miracle, others a tall tale. But I knew the truth. Dad was never the same after that. He hung up his rifle and never hunted bears again. Sometimes I'd catch him staring out into the forest with a look of wonder and guilt on his face. He seemed to understand that he'd been given a second chance, that the very creatures he'd hunted had shown more mercy than he ever had. As for me, that experience changed me forever. Even now, decades later, I can close my eyes and feel the bear's warm fur, smell the earthy scent of the forest. I've never been able to fully explain what happened during those days in the wilderness. All I know is that I experienced something extraordinary, a connection between human and animal that defies explanation. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I dream of that bear. In my dreams, we're walking through sun-dappled forests, exploring hidden caves, and swimming in crystal-clear streams. And when I wake, I swear I can still hear the distant sound of its gentle growl, calling me back to the wild. Story 24. About halfway through the drive, I rounded a bend, and my headlights caught something moving at the edge of the trees. At first, I thought it was a bear, but as I got closer, I realized it was way too big to be any bear I'd ever seen. This thing was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. For a split second, I thought maybe it was some guy in a costume, but then it turned and looked right at me. Those eyes. I'll never forget those eyes. They glowed an eerie yellowish green in my headlights, filled with a terrifying intelligence. This was no man in a suit. This was something else entirely. I hit the gas, trying to speed past it, but the tires slipped in the mud. The truck fishtailed, and I barely kept it on the road. That's when I heard it, a bone-chilling howl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I looked in my rearview mirror, and my blood ran cold. The creature was chasing me. It was unbelievably fast for something so big. In a matter of seconds, it had closed half the distance between us. I could hear its heavy breathing and the thud of its footsteps even over the roar of my engine. Panic set in. I was pushing that old truck as hard as I could, but on that slippery dirt road, I couldn't get up to full speed. The creature was gaining on me. It let out another howl, closer this time. I risked a glance in my side mirror and nearly drove off the road. It was right alongside my truck now. I could see it clearly in the moonlight. It was like some nightmarish cross between a man and an ape. Muscles rippled under its thick fur as it ran. Its face was almost human-like, but with a pronounced brow and a wide, powerful jaw. Those glowing eyes were fixed right on me. Suddenly, it reached out with one massive hand and slammed it against the side of my truck. The whole vehicle shook with the impact. I yelled out in terror, certain that this was how I was going to die, torn apart by some impossible monster on a lonely back road. In desperation, I jerked the wheel hard to the right, trying to ram the creature, but it was too quick. It dodged out of the way and circled around to the other side of the truck. I could hear its claws scraping against the metal of the bed. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I knew I couldn't outrun this thing forever. Sooner or later, I'd hit a rough patch of road or take a turn too fast, and that would be it. I had to do something, and fast. Up ahead, I saw a sharp bend in the road. It was risky, but I had no choice. I waited until the last possible second, then slammed on the brakes and cranked the wheel hard. The tires squealed in protest as the truck skidded sideways. For a terrifying moment, I thought we were going to flip. But somehow, miraculously, the truck stayed upright. I gunned the engine again, fishtailing wildly but picking up speed. I heard a crash and a roar of frustration behind me. Looking back, I saw the creature sprawled in the mud. It had tried to match my turn, but couldn't handle the slippery road. I didn't waste the opportunity. I floored it, pushing that old Ford harder than I ever had before. The engine screamed in protest, but I didn't let up. I drove like that for miles, constantly checking my mirrors, terrified that at any moment I'd see those glowing eyes again. Finally, after what felt like hours, I reached the outskirts of Orleans. As soon as I hit paved road, I headed straight for the sheriff's office. I burst in, covered in mud and sweat, babbling about the monster that had chased me. Looking back now, I'm not surprised they didn't believe me. Hell, I'm not sure I would have believed it if someone else had told me. The deputy on duty clearly thought I was drunk or crazy. He took my statement, but I could tell from the look in his eyes that he wasn't taking it seriously. The strangest part of it all, after that night, it was like my mind just blocked it out. I couldn't remember anything about the incident. It wasn't until years later, when I read an article about similar creature sightings in the area, that it all came flooding back. Even now, decades later, I sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, the memory of those glowing eyes and that bone-chilling howl as fresh as if it happened yesterday. I've never driven that road at night again, and to this day, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, in the dark forests of Northern California, that creature is still roaming. I know how it sounds. Believe me, I do. If I hadn't lived through it myself, I'd probably think it was just some tall tale or the ramblings of a madman. But I know what I saw that night. I know what chased me. And I know that there are things out there in this world that defy explanation. Sometimes late at night, when the wind is howling outside my window, I find myself wondering, what if it's still out there? What if, someday, it decides to come looking for the one that got away? It's those thoughts that keep me up at night, even all these years later. I've never told many people about what happened. Who would believe me? But I'm sharing it now because I think people need to know. We like to think we understand our world, that we've explored every corner and catalogued every creature. But that night taught me that there are still mysteries out there. Dark, terrifying mysteries that lurk just beyond the reach of our headlights. So if you're ever driving down a lonely road in Northern California and you see something big moving in the shadows, don't stop to investigate. Don't slow down. Just drive. Drive as fast as you can, and pray that your car is faster than whatever's chasing you. Because trust me, you don't want to find out what happens if it catches up. Story 25. I was just a kid when it all went down, but I'll never forget that summer of '52 in Braxton County. My family had a little farm on the outskirts of Flatwoods, and life was simple back then. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that was enough. It was early September, and the air was starting to get that crisp feel to it. I remember I was out in the field helping Pa bring in the last of the corn harvest before supper. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. It was the kind of evening that makes you stop and take it all in, you know. As we were heading back to the house, I noticed something odd in the sky. At first I thought it was just a shooting star, but it was moving too slow and leaving a fiery trail behind it. Pa saw it too, and we both stopped in our tracks, watching as this thing, whatever it was, streaked across the darkening sky before disappearing behind the tree line to the west. "What do you reckon that was, Pa?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He just shook his head, a look of concern etched on his weathered face. "I don't rightly know, son, but I got a feeling we best be getting back to the house." We quickened our pace, and I could feel a nervous energy building in my gut. Something just felt off, like the whole world had shifted slightly on its axis. We had just reached the back porch when we heard it, a blood-curdling scream coming from the direction of the Mays place down the road. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a mix between a woman's shriek and some kind of inhuman howl. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up. Pa grabbed his shotgun from just inside the door and told me to stay put. But there was no way I was letting him go alone, so I followed at a distance as he headed towards the source of the commotion. As we got closer to the Mays property, we could hear panicked voices and see flashlight beams dancing erratically through the trees. When we reached the edge of their yard, I'll never forget the scene that greeted us. Kathleen May was on her knees, sobbing hysterically while her boys huddled around her. Several neighbors had already arrived and were milling about, all looking shaken to the core. "What in tarnation is going on here?" Pa demanded, his voice gruff but tinged with worry. One of the other men, I think it was old Mr. Johnson, turned to us with wide eyes. It's some kind of monster. Kathleen and the boys saw it clear as day, standing right there at the edge of the woods. Pa scoffed, but I could tell he was unsettled. Now don't go talking nonsense. There ain't no such thing as... But he was cut off as Kathleen suddenly looked up, her face ashen and tear-streaked. It was real, she cried out, as real as you or me, 10 feet tall if it was an inch, with a round red face and these horrible glowing eyes. A chill ran down my spine as she described the creature. The way she spoke, the raw terror in her voice, there was no doubt in my mind that she believed every word. It had this metallic green body, she continued, her voice shaking, and these claw-like hands. Oh God, when it saw us it made this awful hissing sound and started floating towards us. One of her boys chimed in then, his young voice quavering. It smelled like burning metal, like when Pa's welding in the barn. And it had this point on top of its head, like a hood or something. I remember looking to Pa, expecting him to dismiss it all as hysteria or an overactive imagination. But the look on his face told me he wasn't so sure anymore. There was a tension in the air, a palpable sense of fear that seemed to seep into everything. As the night wore on, more and more people showed up. It seemed like half the county had heard about the Flatwoods monster by midnight. Search parties were formed, men with guns and flashlights combing the woods for any sign of the creature. But they found nothing concrete, just some strange markings on the ground and a lingering, acrid odor that made everyone's eyes water. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside my window had me convinced that the monster was coming for us next. I kept picturing that thing Kathleen described, tall and inhuman, with that blood-red face and glowing eyes. It was like something straight out of a nightmare. The next few days were a blur of activity and wild speculation. Reporters started showing up from all over, eager to get the scoop on the Braxton County monster. The government even sent some men in suits to interview folks and poke around the woods. But it wasn't just the Mays family anymore. Other people started coming forward with their own stories. Charles Stover, a trucker who regularly drove through the area, swore up and down that he'd seen something massive and hairy standing in the middle of the road late one night. Said it was at least 8 feet tall and covered in dark fur, with arms that hung down past its knees. It just stood there staring at me with these glowing red eyes, he told anyone who'd listen. I laid on the horn, and it didn't even flinch. Then it just loped off into the woods, moving faster than anything that big has a right to. Others had similar tales, glimpses of a large, hair-covered figure darting between trees or lurking at the edges of fields. Some folks said it looked more like a bear walking on its hind legs, while others swore it was some kind of alien being. The whole county was on edge. People started locking their doors at night, something most folks around here had never bothered with before. Kids weren't allowed to play outside after dark, and more than a few farmers took to patrolling their property with shotguns at the ready. I remember overhearing Pa talking to Ma late one night, their voices hushed but tense. "I don't know what to make of it all," Pa was saying. "Kathleen May ain't the type to make up stories, and neither is Charles Stover. Something's out there, Sarah, something that don't belong in these woods." Ma's voice was trembling slightly as she replied, "But what if it comes here? What do we do?" There was a long pause before Pa answered. "We protect our own. That's all we can do." Those words stuck with me, filling me with a mix of fear and determination. Whatever this thing was, monster, alien, or something else entirely, it wasn't welcome here. This was our home, and we weren't about to let some creature from who knows where drive us out. As the days turned into weeks, the sightings became less frequent, but the fear remained, a constant undercurrent in everyday life. People talked in hushed tones about government cover-ups and secret military experiments. Some said it was all a hoax, a ploy to bring tourism to our little corner of West Virginia. But those of us who were there that night, who saw the terror in Kathleen May's eyes and felt that indescribable wrongness in the air, we knew better. Even now, all these years later, I can't shake the feeling that something changed in Braxton County that summer. It's like a veil was lifted, giving us a glimpse of something beyond our understanding. The monster, whatever it was, may have faded into legend, but the mark it left on our community remains. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full and the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself staring out into the darkness, and for just a moment, I could swear I see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me from the shadows. It's a reminder that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk just beyond the edge of what we know. The Braxton County monster may be gone, but the mystery and the fear, it inspired lives on. And deep down, I think we're all a little grateful for that lingering uncertainty, because it reminds us to keep our eyes open, to question what we think we know, and to never take for granted the thin line between the world we understand and the vast unknown that lies just beyond our perception.